Charlotte Bennett had 30 seconds before they broke down the jailhouse door. She could hear the rope. Not the crowd, the rope. That single dry creak against the post that meant the decision had already been made before any judge arrived. She pressed her bleeding fingers against the iron bars and made herself breathe. Then the door opened, and through the smoke and the shouting she saw him, a stranger, rifle raised, stepping between her and 41 men who wanted her dead. She whispered it without thinking. "They'll hang me." He looked at her. Just looked. Then he turned to face the entire town and said 4 words so quietly the crowd went completely still. If you've stayed quiet when you should have spoken, this story is for you. Subscribe to our channel, follow Charlotte's story all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The summer of 1882 came to Red Creek, Wyoming territory, like it always did, hard and without apology. The sun pressed down on the dust until the whole main street shimmered at the edges, and the flies buzzed, lazy circles over the horse troughs, and the men who gathered outside Harrington's land office that Tuesday morning fanned themselves with their hats and talked about what needed to be done. They used words like justice. They used words like example. What they meant was punishment. What they meant was that a young woman with no husband and no powerful name had been accused by the most powerful man in the county, and that settled it. Charlotte Bennett had worked as a seamstress in Red Creek for 3 years. She had repaired the shirts of half the men now standing in that crowd. She had hemmed the dresses of their wives. She had never once been late on her rent to Mrs. Poole, never once raised her voice in argument at the dry goods counter, never once given anyone a reason to look twice at her, except to admire the clean, careful stitching she did for $2 a week. None of that was discussed outside Harrington's office. What was discussed was the money. William Harrington, owner of the Double H Ranch, controlling interest in 3 mining operations, primary lender to half the struggling farms within 40 miles, had stood on the steps of his office 2 mornings ago and declared in front of witnesses that $4,000 in cash had gone missing from his private safe, and that the last person with access to his office, the young woman he had hired to repair the upholstery on his reading chairs, had been seen near that safe. He had not said Charlotte Bennett stole the money. He was too careful for that. He had simply said he couldn't explain the disappearance, that it was a terrible thing, that he hoped the appropriate people would look into it, and that he trusted Red Creek's good citizens to do what was right. That was all William Harrington needed to say. The rest happened on its own. Charlotte had been arrested the same afternoon. Sheriff Dale Pruitt, a thick-necked man of 50, who had held his position for 11 years and intended to hold it 11 more, had come to her rented room above the tailor shop with 2 deputies and a pair of iron cuffs, and the expression of a man doing something distasteful but necessary. "Miss Bennett," he had said, standing in her doorway while she sat at her sewing table with a half-finished blouse in her lap. "I need you to come with me." "On what charge?" she had asked. Her voice had been steady. She was proud of that later. "Theft," he said. "Mr. Harrington's filed a formal complaint. Mr. Harrington is lying." Pruitt had looked at her the way men looked at women who said inconvenient things with a patience that was really just a slower form of dismissal. "That'll be for a judge to decide, Miss Bennett. Come along now." She had gone. She had believed in that moment that it would be settled quickly, that someone would listen, that the truth had its own weight and would eventually tip the balance. She had been in Red Creek long enough to know how things worked, but not long enough to understand how badly they could go wrong when the wrong man pointed a finger. The jailhouse was a single-room building behind the courthouse with 2 iron-barred cells and a smell of mildew and old tobacco that never quite left the walls. Charlotte had been placed in the left cell with a wooden cot, a thin blanket, and a tin cup that leaked from a hairline crack along the bottom. The first night she had not slept. She had sat on the edge of that cot and gone over everything she knew, the way you went over a seam to find where it had split methodically, starting at the beginning, pressing each point until she found the break. The break was in the ledger. 3 weeks ago, Harrington had hired her for an unusual job, not sewing, but organization. His office manager had left suddenly, and there was a backlog of correspondence and billing records that needed sorting before his quarterly accounting. He had offered her double her usual rate. She had accepted. She was good with numbers. Her father had been a bookkeeper in Ohio before the drink took him, and he had taught her ledger work the same way he taught her everything impatiently and thoroughly, so that the skill stuck even after she stopped wanting to think about him. On the third day of working through Harrington's records, Charlotte had found something that didn't belong. It was a small thing at first. A column of payments listed against a set of ranch families, the Gardners, the Pruitts, the Wades, that didn't match the loan agreements she'd seen filed in the county records. The amounts were larger. The interest was compounded in a way that wasn't specified in the original terms. And there were fees, page after page of fees for services that had no corresponding receipts. She had kept working, and kept quiet, and kept the ledger page numbers in her memory. On the fifth day, she had found the second set of books. They were in a locked box inside the bottom drawer of Harrington's credenza, a drawer she had been asked to reorganize. The box was old, and the lock was simple, and it had already been opened before she touched it. The hasp bent slightly outward, as though someone had forced it in a hurry and never fixed it properly. Inside were 12 months of real accounts. The money that went in, the money that went out, the gap between what the ranch families owed according to their signed agreements and what they had actually been charged. The difference across all accounts was close to $40,000 over 5 years. Charlotte had stared at those numbers for a long time. Then she had closed the box, put it back exactly as she found it, finished the work Harrington had paid her for, and walked home. She had needed time to think. She had needed to understand what she was dealing with before she decided what to do. She had told no one. 2 days later, Harrington announced that $4,000 was missing from his safe, and the sheriff came to her door with iron cuffs. She understood immediately what had happened. He knew she had found the records. She didn't know how maybe she had moved something slightly left a fingerprint. Maybe one of his other workers had seen her bent over those files too long. It didn't matter how he knew. What mattered was that he had acted first. He had taken $4,000 out of his own safe, manufactured a theft, and pointed at the one person who couldn't fight back. A woman alone. No family in town. No money for a lawyer. No man to stand up in public and demand her name be cleared. It was almost elegant, she thought, in the dark of her jail cell on that first night. The cruelty had a kind of architecture to it. By the second morning, the mood outside had shifted. She could hear it through the jailhouse wall, voices at first scattered, then clustering, then taking on that low collective pressure of a crowd that had reached agreement. Word had gone out about the amount. $4,000. A fortune in this county. And the story had grown in the telling. The way stories always did. She had been seen counting cash. Someone's cousin had seen her trying to leave town. A woman who lived above the butcher shop claimed Charlotte had always seemed shifty, never quite right, too quiet for someone with nothing to hide. Sheriff Pruitt came to her cell at 10 in the morning with a look on his face she had not seen from him before. Not dismissal this time. Something more uncomfortable. Regret, maybe. Or the closest thing to it that a man like Pruitt could manage. "There's talk," he said, standing outside the bars with his hat in his hands. "People are worked up." "I imagine they are," Charlotte said. "Mr. Harrington is a persuasive man." "Miss Bennet." He paused. "Is there anything you want to tell me? Anything that might settle this down before it goes further?" She looked at him steadily. "I want to tell you that I found evidence of systematic fraud in Harrington's records. I want to tell you that he is stealing from the families of this county. I want to tell you that the missing $4,000 never existed, or if it did, he took it himself and blamed me." Pruitt was quiet for a moment. "That's a serious accusation," he said finally. "Yes," she agreed. "It is." He put his hat back on. "I'll need more than your word against his Miss Bennet." "I know where the evidence is." "That ledger box. I know which drawer. I can tell you exactly." "Miss Bennet." His voice had gone flat. "That office is private property. I'd need Harrington's permission to search it, and he's not inclined to give it given the circumstances." She stared at him. "So that's how it is," she said quietly. He didn't answer. He walked back to his desk, and she heard the creak of his chair as he sat down, and then silence, and then the sound of the crowd outside, getting louder. By midday, they were calling for her to be brought out. Not for a trial, for a reckoning. That was the word she heard repeated. Reckoning, reckoning. And she knew what it meant in a town where a powerful man had given permission for it by simply not stopping it. Pruitt came back to her cell at 1 o'clock. He looked worse than he had that morning. Older somehow. Like the last few hours had taken something from him. "I've sent word to the circuit judge," he said. "But it'll be 4 days before he can get here." 4 days, Charlotte repeated. "I'll keep order," he said. But she heard the thing underneath it, the doubt, the calculation of what it would cost him to hold that order against Harrington's influence, and a crowd that had already decided. "Sheriff," she said, "if something happens to me before that judge arrives, those records will still be in Harrington's credenza. Someone will find them eventually." He looked at her for a long moment. "I hope it doesn't come to that," he said. "That was not the same as it won't." They came for her at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Not the whole crowd, maybe 15 men, which was enough. Deputy Harlan, who was 23 and ambitious and understood whose goodwill mattered in this county, opened the jailhouse door and let them in without a word. Charlotte heard the bolt slide, heard the boots on the floorboards, heard voices she recognized. Tom Aldous from the feed store, the Carver brothers, 2 men who worked Harrington's ranch and whose loyalty was paid in wages. She stood up from the cot. She was not going to be sitting down when they came through that cell door. "Miss Bennett." The voice belonged to a man named Corcoran, who ran the livery and had appointed himself the spokesman of crowds on at least 2 other occasions Charlotte could recall. He was a large man with a red face and the particular confidence of someone who had never once been wrong in public. "We think it'd be better for everyone if you came along quiet." "Came along where?" she asked. "Somewhere we can sort this out." "Where the judge won't be inconvenienced," said one of the ranch hands. There was laughter. Charlotte looked at Deputy Harlan, who was standing by the door with his arms crossed and his eyes pointed at the middle distance. "Deputy," she said. He didn't look at her. "Deputy Harlan." Louder this time. He turned his head slightly, not quite meeting her eyes. "Just go easy, Miss Bennett. It'll be better." Better for whom she thought. But she was already calculating. 15 men in a jailhouse built for 2. 1 door in, 1 door out, and Harlan was standing in front of it. The window above the cot was too narrow for a person and opened onto the alley that ran behind the building. She had no weapon. She had her 2 hands and a knowledge of Harrington's accounts that was currently locked in her head, and if these men took her somewhere outside this building, that knowledge died with her. "I'll come," she said. Corcoran nodded with the satisfaction of a man who expected compliance. "But I want it noted," she continued in the clearest voice she had ever used in her life, "that I am being removed from lawful custody without authorization, that Sheriff Pruitt was not consulted, and that every man in this room is committing a crime." The silence was brief. Then Corcoran said, "Nobody's going to be writing any of this down, miss." "Someone always does?" she said. They walked her out through the back, which told her everything she needed to know about how much legitimacy even Corcoran thought this had. The back alley was empty and shadowed, and they moved her through it quickly. 2 men on each arm, her boot heels dragging lines in the dust. She was thinking about the ledger box, about the 12 months of accounts, about whether anyone would ever open that credenza drawer and understand what they were looking at. She was thinking about her father, who had kept books for men like Harrington his whole life, and died with nothing, and how she had told herself she was different, smarter, more careful. She was thinking about how certain she had been 3 years ago, that a woman who kept her head down and did honest work and caused no trouble would be left alone. They turned the corner of the alley and came out behind the courthouse, and there was a crowd there bigger. Now 30 or 40 people standing in the sun, and Charlotte felt the first true wave of fear. Not the managed dread she'd been carrying since the arrest, but the animal kind, the kind that knew the difference between this is bad and this is the end. She looked at the faces in that crowd. Some of them she recognized. Some of them she had sewn for. Most of them were watching with the expression people wore when something was happening that they didn't entirely approve of, but also couldn't quite bring themselves to stop. That look of passive permission that let terrible things happen in bright daylight without anyone ever having to say they wanted it. Harrington was not there. Of course he wasn't. He would be somewhere clean, somewhere with paperwork, somewhere with an alibi. Corcoran said something to the crowd about justice and examples and the need to protect decent people. She stopped listening. She was looking at the rope coiled around the hitching post at the far end of the square. It wasn't for a horse. She had known in the abstract that this could happen. She had not truly believed it until this moment. Her mouth went dry. I am going to die in this town, she thought, and the truth is going to die with me, and Harrington is going to have his quarterly accounting, and his Sunday dinners, and his reputation, and in 5 years nobody will remember my name. She thought of all the ranch families in those ledgers, the Gardners with their 3 young daughters, the Pruitts, a different family than the sheriff, poorer, struggling under debt they didn't know had been inflated. The Wades who had sold their eastern pasture last fall because they couldn't make the payments. She thought of all of them, and she felt something move through her that was not quite courage. Courage was a choice, and this felt less chosen than discovered. Like finding a bone, you didn't know you had something that made her lift her chin and look directly at the man unwinding that rope. My name is Charlotte Bennett, she said loud enough to carry. I am innocent of the charges against me. And before you do whatever you've decided to do, I want everyone here to know that William Harrington has been stealing from the families of this county for 5 years. I have seen the records. I know the accounts. And if you kill me today, you will eventually find out I was telling the truth, and that truth is going to sit in your stomach like something you can't digest for the rest of your lives. Silence. Corcoran looked at her the way people looked at something that kept moving after it was supposed to stop. That's enough, Miss Bennett, he said. No, she said. It isn't. The shot came from the edge of the square. Not fired at anyone, a single crack of sound, high and sharp, a rifle discharged upward into the still afternoon air, and every head turned at once. The man standing at the edge of the crowd was tall. He was wearing a dark hat pushed low over his face, and a coat that had seen years of hard use, and he was holding a lever-action rifle in one hand, with the barrel still pointed at the sky, and he was walking forward with the unhurried certainty of a man who had calculated every distance in that square before he fired. Charlotte had never seen him before in her life. He stopped when he was close enough to be heard clearly, and he lowered the rifle, not aimed at anyone, just held loose across his body. Finger nowhere near the trigger, and he looked at Corcoran with an expression so calm, it was almost worse than anger. I'd appreciate it, he said in a voice that was quiet and level, and somehow carried to every corner of the square. If you'd step back from that woman. Corcoran's red face went a shade redder. This isn't your business, mister. I'm making it mine. You don't know what she's done. I know what you're doing. His eyes moved across the crowd with the same unhurried quality as his walk, touching each face, briefly assessing. And I know that rope wasn't approved by any judge. The judge is 4 days away. Then it'll wait 4 days. Corcoran stepped forward. He was a large man, and he understood the weight of his own presence, and he had never once encountered a situation where that weight failed to matter. There are 30 men here who disagree with you, friend. The man looked at him. I counted 41, he said, and I ain't your friend. He turned his head slightly, and his eyes found Charlotte's, and she saw in them something she hadn't expected. Not pity, not heroism. Something more complicated than either a recognition, like a man looking at something he understood from the inside. Can you walk? He asked her. Her hands were still shaking. She pressed them flat against her skirt so no one could see. Yes, she said. Then walk toward me. She looked at the men on either side of her. Their hands had loosened on her arms when the shot came, and in the collective uncertainty of the moment, no one had retightened their grip. She stepped forward. Nobody stopped her. She walked to him, and she was aware of every footstep, of the dust moving around her boots, of the silence in the square that had a texture to it, the held breath of 41 people deciding whether to act. When she reached him, he moved without looking at her, placing himself between her and the crowd with a small, precise step that was so natural it almost seemed unconscious. A habit. The gesture of a man who had done this before. "Now," he said to Corcoran, and his voice was still that same quiet, "I'm going to walk this woman back to the jailhouse, and every man who follows us is going to have a conversation with a rifle before he gets within 20 feet. I'm not a hard man, and I'm not looking for trouble, but I don't turn around, and I don't back down, and I'd like you to believe that today." Corcoran's jaw was working. "You're making a serious mistake," he said finally. "Might be," the man agreed. He spoke without rancor, without heat, as though the possibility genuinely didn't trouble him. "Wouldn't be the first time I made one on a Tuesday." He turned, which took a certain kind of nerve, turning his back on 41 people, and began to walk. Charlotte walked beside him, matching his pace, and she was aware of how close his arm was to hers, without touching that careful proximity that said, "I'm here," without claiming anything. Behind them, the crowd shifted and murmured. No one followed. They walked 2 blocks before either of them spoke. "Thank you," Charlotte said. Her voice was steadier than she expected. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "They'll regroup. Men like that always do." He glanced sideways at her. "You hurt?" "No. You're holding your hands flat against your dress." She looked down. She hadn't realized she was still doing it. "They shake," she said quietly. "When I'm frightened. They've always done that." He nodded as though this was useful information rather than a vulnerability. "That's a useful thing to know about yourself." They reached the jailhouse. Pruitt was standing outside it, and his face, when he saw them, went through several expressions in rapid succession, relief, alarm, calculation, before settling into something neutral. "Callahan," he said. He clearly knew the man. "Dale," the man said. "She goes back in the cell. Nobody touches her until that judge arrives. I'll be staying in town." Pruitt looked at Charlotte, then at the man named Callahan. "You understand what you're wading into," Pruitt said. It wasn't quite a question. "I do," Callahan said. "Harrington won't." "I know what Harrington won't." His voice didn't change. "Put her back in the cell, Dale, safe. And bring her something to eat. She looks like she hasn't eaten today." Pruitt looked at Charlotte again, and she thought she saw something in his expression that hadn't been there before, something complicated and not entirely comfortable. The look of a man who had been avoiding a decision and had just run out of room to avoid it. "Come on, Miss Bennett," he said. They put her in the cell, and they brought her food, a plate of beans and cornbread, and a cup of coffee that was too hot and too bitter, and the best thing she had ever tasted. Through the jailhouse window, she could hear the square quieting, the crowd dispersing. Whatever momentum had been building toward that rope had broken, and she understood that these things, once broken, rarely fully reassembled. She sat on her cot and ate her food and thought about Ethan Callahan. She had heard the name, she realized. 3 years in Red Creek, and the name had drifted to her the way names of significant people always eventually drifted, not through introduction, not through direct conversation, but through the sideways references that constituted most of what a woman in her position learned about the world. Callahan's place out past the creek. Callahan doesn't come to town much. Callahan and Harrington had words once years back, nobody talks about it. She hadn't known what he looked like. She hadn't known the particular quality of that stillness, or the way he moved, deliberate and unhurried, like a man who had taken the measure of every room he would ever need to walk through and had enough left over. She had not known that someone would fire a rifle into the afternoon sky on her behalf. She set down the empty plate and lay back on the cot and stared at the jailhouse ceiling and thought about the ledger box in Harrington's credenza, about the 12 months of accounts about the Gardner girls and the Wade family and every name in those columns. "I am still alive," she thought. "That means this isn't over. That means I still have time." She pressed her palms flat against the wool blanket and felt them tremble and held them there until they steadied. Outside Red Creek went about its evening. Somewhere a bell rang over the church. Somewhere a horse was being unsaddled in a hurry. Somewhere she knew William Harrington was sitting in a clean room and thinking about what had gone wrong with his Tuesday and how to correct it before the circuit judge arrived. And somewhere not far from this building, A man named Ethan Callahan was staying in town when he hadn't planned to, for reasons she didn't yet understand. And that fact alone, that single strange, unreasonable fact, felt like the first solid thing she had touched in 3 days. She closed her eyes. 4 days, she thought. Hold on, 4 days. Ethan Callahan did not sleep that night. He had taken a room at the Dolan boarding house, the only place in Red Creek that would rent to a man who had just made enemies of half the town, and he sat in the chair by the window with his rifle across his knees and his hat on the table and listened to the sounds the town made when it thought no one was paying attention. It made a lot of sounds. Boots on the boardwalk at 11. Low voices under his window at midnight. 2 men moving quickly and not wanting to be heard. A horse leaving the livery at 12:30, ridden hard toward the eastern road, the road that went among other places to Harrington's Double H Ranch. Ethan noted all of it. He was not a man who surprised easily, and he was not a man who frightened easily, and he had learned a long time ago that what you heard in the dark told you more about a situation than anything said in daylight. Daylight was for performances. The dark was where people showed you what they actually intended. What he heard tonight told him that William Harrington was not finished. He had expected that. A man who built the kind of operation Harrington had built, the quiet fraud, the patient theft, the architecture of debt laid over an entire county, like a slow-moving flood, did not abandon it because one stranger fired a rifle in his town square. He adapted. He recalculated. He found another angle. The question was which angle he would choose and how much time Ethan had before he found out. He thought about Charlotte Bennett. He had watched her walk toward him in that square, with her hands pressed flat against her skirt and her chin lifted, and he had thought not with admiration exactly, but with something more precise. She knows exactly what is happening to her, and she is not pretending otherwise. There was a particular kind of courage in that. Not the theatrical kind, not the kind that required an audience. The quiet, stubborn interior kind that nobody named and nobody rewarded, and that kept people moving when every reasonable calculation said stop. He recognized it because he had needed it himself once. He shifted the rifle on his knees and looked out at the dark street. 4 days until the circuit judge. He had made harder promises. Charlotte woke before dawn with the certainty that something had changed. Not in the cell. The cell was exactly as it had been. The smell of mildew, unchanged, the hairline crack in the tin cup, still there when she touched it. But something in the quality of the silence outside was different, thicker, like the silence before weather. She sat up and pressed her ear to the wall and listened. Footsteps in the main room of the jailhouse. Pruitt's voice, low and careful. Another voice she didn't recognize. Papers. The sound of papers being handled, set down, handled again. She pulled the blanket around her shoulders and sat on the edge of the cot and waited. Pruitt came to her cell at first light. He looked like he hadn't slept any more than she had, and he was carrying 2 cups of coffee, which she took as a sign that whatever he had to say was going to require something to hold on to. He passed one through the bars without comment. Harrington filed additional charges this morning, he said. Charlotte wrapped both hands around the cup. What charges? Conspiracy to defraud, defamation, and... He paused with the discomfort of a man reading words that embarrassed him. Incitement, based on what you said in the square yesterday. She stared at him. He is charging me with incitement for saying he stole money. Yes. While he is the one who sent men to remove me from lawful custody without a court order. Miss Bennett, did you file any report about what happened yesterday? Her voice was steady, but the coffee cup was warm, and she needed it to be warm. About the fact that your deputy opened this door and let 15 men walk me out of here. Pruitt was quiet for a long moment. Harlan says you came voluntarily, he said finally. The silence after that sentence had a specific weight to it. I see, Charlotte said. I'm trying to... He stopped, started again. The judge will be here in 4 days. If you can hold on 4 days. You said that yesterday. She looked at him. Yesterday, the rope was already tied. He had nothing to say to that. He stood outside her cell with his coffee cup and his bad sleep and his insufficient answers, And finally he turned and walked back to his desk, and she heard him sit down, and then nothing else. She drank the coffee. She thought about Harrington's credenza. She thought about the ledger box. And she thought about whether 4 days was a measurement of safety or a measurement of how much time she had left. Ethan came to the jailhouse at 7 in the morning, and Pruitt let him in with the expression of a man who had decided that managing 2 complicated situations simultaneously was marginally better than managing 1 catastrophic one. He stopped outside her cell and looked at her the way he had looked at the crowd in the square, assessingly, without the social coding that most people put over direct observation. "You eat?" he asked. Pruitt brought bread. "How are you holding up?" She considered giving him the polite answer. Then she looked at his face. The dark eyes, the particular quality of his attention that suggested he was actually interested in the true answer, and she said, "I'm frightened, and I'm angry, and the anger is more useful, so I'm focusing on that." Something in his expression shifted very slightly. Approval, maybe. "Harrington filed new charges this morning," she said. "Conspiracy, defamation, incitement." "I heard." "How did you hear already?" "I've been up since before he filed them." He said it without elaboration, and she understood that he had been watching in the night. That the sounds she'd heard or not heard through her jailhouse wall had included him. "He's trying to complicate the judge's arrival," she said. "More charges means more time to sort through more questions about jurisdiction, more opportunity for delays." Ethan nodded. "That's right." "Which means 4 days may not be 4 days." "That's also right." She looked at him. "You're not very reassuring." "I'm not trying to reassure you," he said. "I figure you'd rather know what you're actually dealing with." That was so precisely correct that she almost laughed. She pressed her lips together instead. "The evidence is in his office, a locked box in the bottom drawer of his credenza. Inside is a second set of accounts. 12 months of real numbers against the falsified records he files publicly. The gap across all his debtors is close to $40,000 over 5 years. Ethan was still for a moment. "You're sure about the numbers?" "I'm very good with numbers," she said quietly. "It was the only useful thing my father ever taught me." He looked at her for another moment, and she had the uncomfortable sensation of being understood more completely than she had prepared for. "Who else knows about the second ledger?" "No one. Unless Harrington has told someone. He must suspect I saw it, that's why he moved against me. But I don't know how much he knows about what I found." "If he knew you'd seen the full accounts, you'd already be dead," Ethan said. "So right now he thinks you have partial knowledge. Enough to be dangerous, not enough to be conclusive. Which means he'll try to discredit me before the judge arrives rather than—" She stopped. "Rather than something more permanent," he said evenly. "Yes, that buys you time. Not much, but some." She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Not from cold, the morning was already warm. From the need to hold something solid. "Mr. Callahan," she said, "why are you doing this?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "Because I know what it looks like when a man like Harrington sets his machinery in motion against someone who can't stop it alone. I've seen it before." A pause. "I've been on the other side of it." She waited. "My brother," he said. 7 years ago. Different county, different man, same machinery. Accusation, first evidence, arranged second verdict before anyone thought to ask questions." He looked at the jailhouse wall. He didn't have 4 days. The silence between them was careful and complete. "I'm sorry," Charlotte said. "It was a long time ago." But his voice, always so level, had something in it now. Not grief exactly, something more calcified than grief. The residue of an old wound that had healed wrong. "I swore after that if I ever saw it happening again to somebody who was still alive, I wouldn't stand still for it. That's all this is." She looked at him steadily. "That isn't a small thing." "No," he agreed. "It ain't." Corcoran came to the jailhouse at 10 o'clock with 3 men and a piece of paper. The paper was a letter, he said, from William Harrington to Sheriff Pruitt, requesting that the prisoner be transferred to the county seat for safekeeping, given the security issues evidenced by the previous day's incident. The county seat was 30 miles away. The circuit judge's route did not pass through it. Pruitt stood in the doorway of his jailhouse and read the letter twice. "He can't compel that," Ethan said from behind Pruitt. "He had not gone anywhere. Harrington's a private citizen. He doesn't have transfer authority." "He has relationships," Corcoran said. His red face was carefully controlled today, yesterday's anger replaced with something more deliberate. "He has the county commissioner's ear. He has a letter," Ethan said. "Dale, that letter is not a court order. You know it isn't." Pruitt looked at the paper. He looked at Corcoran. He looked at Ethan. Charlotte, watching through her cell bars, saw the exact moment Pruitt decided which way he was going to fall. It was in his shoulders, a small settling, like a man putting down something he'd been carrying too long. "I'll need an order from the commissioner himself," Pruitt said. "In person, not a letter." Corcoran's jaw tightened. "That can be arranged." "Then arrange it," Pruitt said. "Until then, she stays." Corcoran looked past him at Charlotte. The look was not threatening exactly. It was something cooler than threatening, the look of a man adjusting a plan rather than abandoning it. "Miss Bennett," he said pleasantly, "you might want to think about what kind of friends are worth having." "I'm thinking about it right now," she said. He left. His 3 men followed. Ethan watched them go, then turned back to Charlotte. Something moved across his face that she was starting to learn to read, the brief tightening that meant he was calculating something he hadn't told her yet. "He's going to the commissioner," she said. "Yes." "How quickly can Harrington get that order?" Ethan's jaw set. "By tonight if he moves fast. Maybe morning if the commissioner wants to appear deliberate about it." "So we have until tonight." He looked at her directly. "We have until tonight," he confirmed. What happened next was the thing Charlotte would think about later. Not the danger, not the fear, but the particular quality of the hour between noon and 1 o'clock, when Ethan sat on the other side of her cell bars and they talked. Not about the ledger, not about Harrington or the judge or the transfer order. He had brought her lunch from the boarding house kitchen, a proper meal. Mrs. Dolan's beef stew and actual bread, not the commissary variety. And they sat on opposite sides of those bars and ate, and somehow the conversation found its way to the things that had made them each into the people who were sitting here. "You said your father was a bookkeeper," Ethan said, "in Ohio, before we came west." She moved the bread around the edges of her bowl. "He was good at it. Numbers made sense to him in a way that people didn't. He was not a warm man, but he was precise. He taught me the way you'd teach a useful skill to an employee." "That isn't what I'd call a good father." "No," she agreed, "but it's what I had." I was quiet for a moment. "My father was the opposite. Warm, too trusting. Believed people were basically good and operating from basically good motives." A pause. "He was wrong about that. Turns out it matters." "Is that why you don't trust people?" He looked at her. "I trust people. I just trust them to be exactly what they are." She considered that. "And what am I?" He didn't hesitate. "A woman who found evidence of a crime and couldn't stay quiet about it even when staying quiet would have been safer. Someone who said her name out loud in a square full of people who wanted to hurt her." He met her eyes. "A person who keeps her hands flat against her skirt so nobody can see them shake and then steadies them on her own." Charlotte was silent for a long moment. "You noticed that," she said finally. "I notice most things." She looked down at her hands resting still now in her lap. "My mother used to say it was unbecoming. A woman who shook when she was frightened." "Your mother was wrong," Ethan said simply. She looked up. "Shaking just means your body knows what's real," he said. "It's the people who don't shake who worry me. Usually means they've stopped paying attention." She didn't know what to do with that. So she did what she always did when something got too close to a truth she wasn't ready for. She moved to the practical. "If Harrington gets that transfer order," she said, "I need someone to go into his office before they move me." Charlotte. It was the first time he'd used her given name, and he didn't seem to notice he'd done it. "I'm not sending anyone into that office. I know the exact location. It's breaking and entering. Any evidence found that way gets thrown before a judge before you finish saying the word inadmissible. She stopped. He was right. She had known it had been pushing against it because the alternative was sitting in this cell and waiting for a transfer order that would make everything worse. But he was right. Then what do we do? She asked. He set down his empty bowl and looked at her with that same level attention. We need a witness, he said. Someone who was inside that office legitimately. Someone who saw those records before Harrington had a chance to move them or destroy them. His office manager left. I know. Martin Reeves. He left 6 weeks ago, which is roughly when Harrington started worrying about the accounts. Reeves is in Laramie. She stared at him. How do you know that? Because I've been watching Harrington for 8 months, he said. The sentence landed in the silence between them like a stone dropped in still water. She waited. Not for your sake. He added in a tone that was neither apology nor explanation, but something between them. I had my own reasons. His operation has been bleeding the smaller ranches in this county for years. I knew 3 families who lost land to his debt manipulation. I started paying attention. He paused. I hadn't found a way to move against him that would stick. The evidence I'd gathered was circumstantial patterns, not proof. He was careful. Until I walked into his office and found the second set of books, Charlotte said quietly. Until that, he agreed. She felt something settle in her chest, not relief, not quite. More like the specific sensation of 2 separate strands of something suddenly becoming one thread. Martin Reeves, she said. He kept those records for the last 2 years. He would have known they existed. He left because... Ethan stopped. Because he knew what they meant, Charlotte finished. Because he was afraid. Yes. He can testify. If he'll testify, a frightened man in Laramie is safer than a brave man in Red Creek. I don't know yet which one Reeves wants to be. Someone needs to go to Laramie, she said. Someone needs to go to Laramie, he agreed. And someone needs to stay here. She understood immediately. You can't do both. No. She pressed her palms flat against her knees and thought through it the way her father had taught her to think through a ledger, methodically starting at what was known and working toward what wasn't. Someone had to go to Laramie to find Reeves. Someone had to stay in Red Creek to ensure the transfer order didn't move her before the judge arrived. Ethan was the only person currently between her and everything Harrington could arrange. If you leave, she said, Pruitt won't hold against a commissioner's order. No. And if you stay, Reeves doesn't come. Also no. The math was not good. There has to be someone else, she said. Someone in this town who... I'm working on that, he said. And something in his voice told her he had already been working on it, that this conversation had been leading somewhere specific, and they had just arrived. Who? She asked. He looked at her steadily. There's a woman named Agnes Fowler, he said. She's 70 years old, and she has been the postmistress in Red Creek for 22 years. She was the one who told me Reeves was in Laramie. Charlotte was very still. She knows about the accounts. She knows about patterns, knows which letters Harrington sends and when, knows that Reeves left in a hurry, knows that 2 ranch families received letters from their bank the same week their land transferred to Harrington's name. He paused. Agnes Fowler knows most things that move through this town. She's just never had a reason to say any of it out loud in a room where it could matter. Could she be a witness? Corroborating, not primary. He met her eyes. You are the primary witness, Charlotte. You're the one who saw those records. Everything else supports your account. Her name again. Still without him seeming to notice. She noticed. And if Harrington destroys the records before the judge arrives, then your testimony and Reeves's testimony and Agnes's patterns are still enough to open an investigation, he said. It won't be as clean, but it'll be enough to make it very uncomfortable for a man who's spent years being very comfortable. She breathed out slowly. That's not justice. No, he agreed. But it's a start, and starts have a way of becoming something bigger once a judge starts pulling the thread. She looked at him for a long moment. This man she had known for less than 24 hours, who had walked into a square full of armed men and spoken in a calm voice, and changed the direction of everything who had told her about his brother in the same even tone he used to discuss transfer orders, who looked at her shaking hands and said, "Your mother was wrong." "Who goes to Laramie?" she asked. He had already decided. She could see it in him. "Tom Briggs," he said. "He runs the telegraph station at the east edge of town. He's got a fast horse and he's not on Harrington's payroll, and he's owed me a favor since the winter of '79. He leaves within the hour." "Does he know what he's riding into?" "He will when I tell him." "And if Reeves won't come?" "Then Briggs brings a written statement, signed, notarized if he can find a notary in Laramie, and there's at least one." He stood up from his side of the bars, collecting both empty bowls. "Charlotte, I need you to write down everything you remember about those accounts. Every number, every name, every column, every discrepancy." "I don't have paper." He reached inside his coat and produced a small notebook and a pencil stub and passed them through the bars without ceremony. "Pruitt won't like that," she said. "Pruitt's going to have to like quite a few things he wasn't planning on," Ethan said. She almost smiled. She stopped herself. It didn't feel like the right moment for smiling, but it was close. She wrote for 3 hours straight. It was the strangest experience of the entire ordeal, stranger than the arrest. Stranger than the square stranger, than the night in the cell, sitting on a jailhouse cot with a pencil stub and a borrowed notebook reconstructing from memory the second set of William Harrington's accounts. Her father had taught her a bookkeeper's memory. You held numbers the way other people held names, not as abstractions, but as personalities, each figure with its own character, its own relationship to the figures around it. She had looked at those accounts for 2 days, and she had not known then that she would need to remember them exactly. But her mind had done what her father's mind always did, had filed each column and row with the same methodical precision she used on a seam, measuring, aligning, noting where things didn't quite meet. She wrote it all down, every family name, every loan amount, every inflated interest calculation, every fee with no corresponding receipt, every date, every signature. When she finished, her hand was cramped, and the pencil was down to half its length, and the notebook was full past the halfway mark. She called for Pruitt, and he came, and she passed the notebook through the bars. "Get this to Mr. Callahan," she said. Pruitt looked at the notebook, at her, at the notebook again. "Miss Bennett," he said, "if this is what I think it is." "It's what you think it is," she said. He stood there holding it with an expression she had seen on men before, men who knew they were at the edge of a decision that would define them and were discovering that the person they actually were was not entirely the person they had thought. "I have a daughter," he said abruptly. She waited. "She's 17, smart girl, works at the dry goods counter." He was still looking at the note. "She wants to go to school in the fall. Teacher's school in Cheyenne." A pause. "Her mother's been ill. Medical bills." "I understand," and Charlotte said quietly. "Harrington holds the note on my house," he said. There it was. The thing that had been underneath all the insufficient answers, all the careful neutrality. Not corruption exactly, not malice. The older, quieter, more ordinary thing, a man trapped by debt doing the minimum required to not make things worse, which in this case meant doing almost nothing at all. She looked at him. "What's your daughter's name?" she asked. He blinked. "Ruth." "Ruth Pruitt," Charlotte said. "What do you want her to know about who her father was?" The silence was very long. Then Pruitt took the notebook, put it in his breast pocket, and walked out the door. Ethan was back within the hour. He stopped at her cell and held up 2 fingers. "Briggs left 20 minutes ago," he said. "Fast horse, clear road, he'll make Laramie by tonight." "And Agnes Fowler?" "Agnes Fowler," he said, "is a remarkable woman. She'd already written down most of what she knew. She's been waiting, I think, for someone to ask." "How long?" "She said she's had notes since the winter of '80, 2 years. Charlotte stared at him. "She's been keeping records. She keeps records of everything. Postmistress habit." He almost smiled. It was the first time she had seen anything close to a smile from him, and it changed his face in a way that was difficult not to look at. She said, and I am quoting that she was waiting for a fool brave enough to start the fire. She appears to have decided that you qualify." "She's not wrong," Charlotte said. "No," he agreed. "She isn't." She held his gaze for a moment. The afternoon was moving toward evening, and the light through the jailhouse window was going golden and long, and somewhere outside a horse was being led slowly down the main street, and the town was going about its business with that particular determined normalcy of a place that has decided the disruption of yesterday can be absorbed and set aside. Harrington was still out there. The transfer order was still coming. The judge was still 4 days away, and 4 days, as she had said, might not be 4 days. But Briggs was writing to Laramie. Agnes Fowler had 2 years of notes. Pruitt had a notebook full of reconstructed accounts in his breast pocket, and a daughter named Ruth who wanted to go to school in Cheyenne. And Ethan Callahan was standing outside her cell with his hat in his hands and his rifle leaned against the wall, and the expression of a man who had made a promise to himself 7 years ago and intended to keep it. "Mr. Callahan," she said. "Ethan," he said. She considered that for a moment. "Ethan," she said, "if this goes wrong, it won't. But if it does, Charlotte." His voice was quiet and absolute the way a fact is quiet and absolute. "I have stood still while a bad thing happened to someone who deserved better, and I have lived with that for 7 years, and I am not doing it again. That is the full extent of my position on the matter." She looked at him for a long time. "Then I'll stop asking about what happens if it goes wrong," she said. "I'd appreciate that," he said. The light through the window turned another shade of gold. Outside somewhere, a door opened and closed. The ordinary sounds of a town that had no idea what was about to change. She picked up her pencil stub. She still had things she needed to write down, and for the first time in 3 days, her hands were completely steady. The commissioner's order arrived at 9 o'clock that evening. Not in the morning, not with deliberate delay. Harrington had moved fast, moved hard, called in every favor and every pressure point he had accumulated over 11 years of holding paper on half the county. The order was signed, stamped and delivered by a man Charlotte had never seen before, riding a horse that had clearly been pushed. Pruitt stood in the doorway of the jailhouse and read it. Then he folded it carefully in half and put it in his desk drawer. "I'll need to verify its authenticity," he said. The courier looked at him. "It's authentic." "That may be," Pruitt said. "But procedure requires that I confirm the commissioner's signature with his office directly. That communication will go by telegraph first thing in the morning." He looked at the courier with the steady, unhurried expression of a man who had made a decision he was no longer going to argue about. "You're welcome to spend the night at the Dolan house. I believe they have a room." The courier left. He did not look satisfied. Pruitt sat down at his desk. Ethan, who had been standing in the corner throughout this exchange, picked up his hat. "I'll be outside," he said. "I know you will," Pruitt said. Ethan paused at the door. He looked back at Pruitt with an expression that held something careful in it, not quite respect, not yet, but the possibility of it. "Ruth's a good name," he said. Pruitt looked up at him sharply. Then he looked away. "Get out of my jailhouse, Callahan," he said. But his voice was not unkind. Charlotte lay on her cot in the dark and listened to the town settle into its night sounds, and she thought about everything she had set in motion and everything she could not control, and somewhere in that calculation she fell asleep. She dreamed about her father's ledger books, the neat columns, the precise figures, the way he would run his finger down a page and find the error that no one else could see. In the dream, he was younger than she had ever known him, and his hands were steady, and he was showing her something in the numbers pointing to a row she hadn't seen before. Right there he was saying, "It's been there the whole time. You just had to know where to look." She woke up with the first gray light coming through the window, and she lay still for a moment with the dream fading, and then she sat up. 3 days until the judge. Briggs was in Laramie. Agnes Fowler had 2 years of notes, and somewhere across this town in a room she had never seen. Ethan Callahan was awake. She was certain of it, certain in a way she couldn't fully account for, watching the street, listening to the dark, keeping a promise he had made to a dead brother, and was now by some chain of events neither of them had planned keeping also for her. She pressed her palms flat against her knees. Steady. Right there, her father's voice said, fading with the dream. It's been there the whole time. She knew. She just needed 3 more days to prove it. 3 days. That was what Charlotte had told herself the night before. 3 days until the judge, 3 days to hold on 3 days, and then the truth would have a room to stand in, and someone with the authority to hear it. She did not get 3 days. What she got was 36 hours, and then everything broke open at once. It started quietly, the way the worst things always did in Red Creek. Not with a gunshot or a shout, but with a single piece of information moving through the town, like water finding a crack in stone, slow and patient, and then suddenly, everywhere. Pruitt came to her cell at 7 in the morning, with his face arranged in the careful neutral expression she had learned meant he was managing something he didn't want to show. "Briggs is back," he said. Charlotte sat up straight. Already, he couldn't have reached Laramie and returned by— "He didn't reach Laramie," Pruitt said. The silence was very short and very loud. "What happened?" "He was stopped on the Eastern Road, about 12 miles out." Pruitt set a tin cup of coffee through the bars. "2 of Harrington's men. They didn't hurt him. They just turned him around and told him that the road east was under repair and travel wasn't advised." Charlotte stared at him. "They blocked the road. They suggested it was inadvisable." "That's the same thing." "Legally," Pruitt said slowly, "it's a different thing." She put the coffee down without drinking it. Her mind was already moving, already recalculating, pushing through the implications the way her father had taught her to push through a column that didn't balance, not with panic, but with the deliberate pressure of someone who refused to accept an error without finding it. Reeves was still in Laramie. Briggs had not reached him. The written statement that would corroborate her testimony did not exist yet, and Harrington now knew they had tried to get it, which meant he also knew she had named Reeves as a witness, which meant, "He'll go after Reeves," she said. Pruitt's jaw tightened by a fraction. "That's possible." "It's not possible, it's certain." She looked at him directly. "If Harrington gets to Reeves before anyone else does, there will be no corroboration. My testimony and Agnes Fowler's notes won't be enough on their own. And Harrington's lawyers will make the case that a seamstress found with access to a wealthy man's office has obvious motive to fabricate." She stopped. "He's been thinking several steps ahead this entire time." "Yes," Pruitt said. "He has." She heard the thing underneath it, the shift in Pruitt's voice, the way "yes" sat in his mouth with the weight of a man who was no longer pretending he hadn't noticed. "Where is Ethan?" she asked. "Outside," Pruitt said. "He knows about Briggs. I need to talk to him." Pruitt looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the cell door. Then he reached for the keyring on his belt, with the deliberate movement of someone choosing to do a thing they could not unchoose. "The door stays open," he said. "And I'm at my desk." "Yes," Charlotte said. "That's fine." Ethan came in without his hat, which she had come to understand was a tell when he was thinking hard about something, really drilling down into the problem. The hat came off. He stood inside the open cell door and looked at her with those dark eyes that cataloged everything and gave back only what he decided to give. "Briggs told you," she said. "He told me." He leaned against the door frame, not casual, but contained the posture of a man keeping himself from moving while he thought. "Harrington moved faster than I expected. He knows about Reeves." "Yes." "Which means someone talked." Ethan was quiet for a beat. "Or someone was listening. I had that conversation with Briggs near the telegraph station. It's possible." He stopped. "It doesn't matter how he knows. What matters is what we do about it. We need someone to reach Reeves before Harrington does. Briggs can't go east. I have an alternative route south through the Catcher Pass, and then northeast to Laramie avoids the main road entirely. Takes longer. An extra day, maybe a day and a half." "We don't have a day and a half." "No," he said. "We probably don't." She looked at him steadily. "Then you have to go." He met her eyes. "If you leave," she said, "Pruitt won't hold indefinitely. Another order will come, a real one this time, and without you here." She stopped herself. I know what I'm saying. I'm saying go anyway. Because if you stay here and protect me, and Reeves is never reached, then I survive the next 3 days and lose everything after that. The case falls apart. Harrington walks. And every family in those ledgers stays buried under $40,000 of debt they were never meant to pay. The silence between them had a specific character, dense with everything being weighed. I'm not leaving you alone in this cell, Ethan said. I won't be alone. Pruitt is a man with a mortgage and a sick wife and a daughter who needs school money, Ethan said, and his voice was not unkind, but it was precise. He's done more than I expected. I don't know how much more he has in him. Then we find someone else, Charlotte said. Agnes Fowler. Agnes Fowler is 70 years old. Agnes Fowler has been keeping records for 2 years, while every man in this town looked the other way, Charlotte said sharply. Don't underestimate her because of her age. Something moved in his expression. Fair point, he said quietly. There has to be another way to Laramie, she said. Another person who can ride it. Someone Harrington isn't watching. Ethan was quiet. She could see him moving through names, faces, calculations, the same methodical pressure she applied to a ledger column, working through what was known toward what wasn't. The Gardner family, he said slowly. Their ranch is 8 miles south. Harrington holds their debt, a manipulated debt. Your records show that. They have 2 grown sons. Charlotte went still. The Gardners would have every reason. Yes, Ethan said. They would. Can you reach them? He pushed off the door frame. I can reach them by noon. Then go, she said. He looked at her. She looked back at him with the same level attention he had given her from the very first moment in that square, and she said, Ethan, I found the evidence. I can hold this cell for 2 days. Go get the witness. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Agnes Fowler's house is on Maple Street, the blue one with the broken front step. If anything happens, anything, you send Pruitt directly to her. She'll know what to do. All right. Don't sign anything. Don't agree to any transfer commissioner's order, or otherwise until I'm back. I won't. And Charlotte. He stopped. The hat was still in his hand, and he looked at it for a moment, then back at her. I'll be back before that judge arrives. That's not a hope. That's a fact I'm making. She held his gaze. I know, she said. And the strange thing, the thing she would think about later, much later, when she was trying to understand exactly when everything changed, was that she did know. Not because she had evidence of it, not because the logic supported it, but because Ethan Callahan had said it in the same voice he used for everything else that was simply true, and she had learned in 48 hours that his voice did not lie. He left. The cell felt different without him in the doorway. Not worse, just more clearly what it was. A small iron room with a hairline crack in the tin cup and a wool blanket that smelled of other people's fear. Charlotte picked up the pencil stub. She had more to write. He made the Gardner Ranch by 11. The oldest son. James Gardner, 26, with his father's broad shoulders and his mother's careful eyes, listened to everything Ethan said without interrupting. They stood in the yard, and Ethan laid it out in plain order, the accounts, the manipulated debt, Charlotte Bennett's evidence, the blocked road, the need for Reeves. When Ethan finished, James Gardner was quiet for a moment. The ledgers, he said. They show the real numbers, what we actually owe. What you actually owe, Ethan said. And what about 40 other families actually owe? It's a fraction of what Harrington's been collecting. James looked at the house behind him. Inside, his father was recovering from a chest illness that had kept him bedridden for 6 weeks. 6 weeks, during which the Gardner boys had been managing the ranch alone, making payments they could barely afford, watching the eastern pasture, and calculating how long before they'd have to sell it the way the Wades had sold theirs. My brother can ride it, James said. He knows the South Pass. He can be in Laramie by morning. He'll need to find Martin Reeves at the Central Hotel on 2nd Street, Ethan said. And he needs Reeves to understand that his testimony is the difference between Harrington facing a judge and Harrington walking free. And if Reeves is afraid, Ethan looked at him steadily. Tell him that a woman is sitting in a jailhouse cell who was braver than she had any reason to be. Tell him she named him as a witness, even knowing it would complicate things for her. And ask him what kind of man he wants to be when this is over." James Gardner looked at him for a long moment. "You care," he said. "Not an accusation, just an observation." Ethan was quiet for a beat. "I care about what's right." James nodded slowly. "Same thing sometimes." He called for his brother. The younger Gardner, Daniel, 23, with a horse that was the fastest on the South Road, and a reason that was entirely personal, was saddled and riding within 15 minutes. Ethan watched him go. Then he turned his horse back toward Red Creek, and he rode hard, because something in the air had shifted while he was at the Gardner Ranch, a particular quality of pressure that he had learned over 35 years of reading. Weather and men meant something was about to break. He was 3 miles out when he heard the second shot. This one was not fired into the sky. Ethan heard it a single crack from the direction of the main street and put his heels to his horse without thinking, covering the 3 miles in a time that would have impressed him if he'd been thinking about anything other than what he might find when he arrived. What he found was a crowd again, bigger than the first one. 30, maybe 40 people gathered outside the jailhouse with an energy that was different from 2 days ago. Less organized, more volatile. The specific electricity of people who had been building toward something for 48 hours and had just been given a reason to let it out. The reason was on the jailhouse steps. Pruitt was standing with his hand pressed to his left arm, blood seeping through his fingers, and beside him was Deputy Harlan, not with his arms crossed and his eyes averted this time, but with his hand on his holster, and the expression of a man who had switched sides and was now committed to it. Ethan dismounted moving, which was a skill that looked effortless and wasn't. He pushed through the outer edge of the crowd, and people moved, because people always moved for Ethan Callahan when he was moving like that, not threateningly, just with that quality of total commitment that made getting in the way feel like a personal decision with consequences. He reached Pruitt in 30 seconds. "Dale." He put his hand on Pruitt's shoulder and looked at the arm. The wound was a graze bad enough to bleed, not bad enough to be fatal. "Who did this?" Pruitt's face was pale and set. "Harlan," he said. Simply. Completely. Ethan looked at Harlan, who looked back at him with the particular defiance of a young man who had made a choice he could not now unmake and was going to stand by it, because standing by it was the only alternative to admitting what it meant. "She's being transferred," Harlan said. "Commissioner's order. You had your chance to do this the right way." "Where is she?" Ethan said. "Inside." Harlan. Ethan's voice had not risen. It didn't need to. "I'm going to walk into that jailhouse and I'm going to bring Charlotte Bennett back out and put her in front of a judge, and that judge is going to hear every word she has to say. And the only question on the table right now is whether you are going to be part of the story of how justice happened in this county, or part of the story of how one young deputy shot his own sheriff in the arm and sided with a man who's been robbing your neighbors for 5 years. Harlan's jaw was tight. "Think carefully," Ethan said. The crowd behind him was very quiet. Harlan looked at Pruitt, at the blood on Pruitt's sleeve, at the expression on Pruitt's face that was not angry, but was something almost worse than anger. Something that looked like sorrow, like a man watching a young person he'd been responsible for make a mistake that would follow them. Something shifted in Harlan's face. Something young and afraid surfaced briefly under the defiance. His hand moved away from his holster. Ethan walked into the jailhouse. Charlotte was standing in the middle of her cell, not sitting on the cot, not pressed against the wall, standing in the center with her hands at her sides and her chin up, and the particular expression of someone who has decided that whatever comes through the door, they are going to meet it on their feet. When she saw Ethan, something happened to her face that she did not have time to control, a loosening, a rush of relief, so complete and unguarded that it was more honest than anything either of them had yet said to each other. She caught it. She didn't look away from it. "You came back," she said. "Said I would." "I heard a shot." Pruitt's arm. "He's all right." He crossed to the cell, produced the key. He had it because Pruitt had given it to him, an hour after the commissioner's first order arrived, without explanation, with the gesture of a man distributing a responsibility he could no longer carry alone. "We're moving." "To where?" Agnes Fowler's. He opened the cell door. The jailhouse isn't safe anymore. Harlan's compromised, the transfer order is real, and I can't hold the doorway indefinitely. He met her eyes. Agnes's house is on a side street. She has a back room that she's offered. And she has 2 years of records that she is, as of this morning, ready to put in front of anyone who asks. Charlotte stepped out of the cell. She had been in it for 3 days. The floor felt different under her feet. Same floor, same boards. But the act of crossing that threshold without permission felt like something else entirely. "Harrington will look for me," she said. "Harrington is going to be very busy in the next few hours," Ethan said. "Daniel Gardner is in Laramie right now. And I did something before I left for the Gardner ranch that I didn't tell you about." She looked at him. "I sent a telegraph," he said, "to the federal land office in Cheyenne." Charlotte went very still. "Federal," she said. "Harrington's fraud crosses county lines. 3 of the families he's manipulated have land grants that fall under federal jurisdiction. The land office has a marshal on staff, Thomas Hale. I've dealt with him before. He's an honest man." Ethan moved toward the jailhouse door, checking the street through the window before opening it. "The telegraph went out yesterday morning. If Hale moves fast, a federal marshal changes everything," Charlotte said. "Harrington can manage a county judge. He can pressure a commissioner. He cannot suppress a federal investigation." "No," Ethan said. "He cannot." She stared at him. "You had this in motion before Daniel Gardner even rode for Laramie." "I've been in motion since Monday night," he said quietly. "I just didn't tell you all of it because I didn't want to give you hope on something that might not come through." She absorbed this. That was either very considerate or very arrogant. "Probably both," he admitted. For the first time in 3 days, she genuinely smiled. Not the controlled expression she had managed in the square. Not the grim determination of the past. 48 hours. An actual, unguarded smile. Brief and real, and Ethan Callahan looked at it with the expression of a man who had not expected it and did not know quite what to do with what it made him feel. "Come on," he said. "We move fast and quiet. Harlan won't stop us, not now. But Harrington's men are on the street." "How many?" "4 that I've seen, likely more. And we're going to walk past them." "We're going to walk past them," he confirmed. "Because the alternative is staying in that cell, and that cell is no longer safe." She looked at the open door. She looked at him. "All right," she said. "Let's walk." They went out the back. Pruitt had wrapped his arm in a strip of cloth torn from his desk drawer and was sitting behind his desk with the steady, deliberate calm of a man who had decided he was done being moved by anyone. He looked up when they came through. "The blue house on Maple," he said, to Ethan, not quite looking at Charlotte. Then he looked at Charlotte. "Miss Bennett," he said, "I've written a report about what happened yesterday and today and what Deputy Harlan did." A pause. "I've included what I remember of what you told me, about the accounts." "That's—" She stopped. "Thank you, Sheriff." "Ruth," he said. Just the name. As if that was all the explanation needed. She nodded. "Yes." He looked back at his desk. "Get out of my jailhouse," he said. The same words he had said to Ethan the night before. The same tone, not unkind. Almost the opposite. The back streets of Red Creek in the mid-morning were quieter than the main road, but not empty. Ethan moved with his hand near, but not on his rifle, and Charlotte walked beside him with her arms straight and her stride even and her eyes moving the same way his did, not frantically, but with the steady cataloging attention she had developed over 3 days of paying very careful attention to everything. They were half a block from Maple Street when one of Harrington's men stepped out of the alley beside the cooper's shop. He was a big man Charlotte didn't recognize with the particular blankness of someone who was paid not to think about what he was doing. "Miss Bennett," he said, polite, almost. "Mr. Harrington would like a word." "Mr. Harrington," Charlotte said, "can wait for his word until a judge is present to hear it alongside him." "That's not—" "Son." Ethan's voice was very quiet. "Look around you." The man looked. To his left, Agnes Fowler, who had apparently followed them from the moment they left the jailhouse, had appeared at the mouth of the alley, with a carpet bag over one arm, and the expression of a woman who had waited 2 years for this moment and was enjoying it thoroughly. To his right, James Gardner, who had ridden in from the South Road while Ethan was at the jailhouse, was standing with his arms crossed and the look of a man with a very specific grievance and the patience to act on it correctly. Behind them at the corner, Pruitt, arm-wrapped blood seeping slightly through the cloth, standing in the middle of the street with a kind of battered, upright dignity that made him look for the first time in Charlotte's memory like the lawman he had been elected to be. The big man looked at all of it. "I'll tell Mr. Harrington," he said finally, "that you weren't available." "You do that," Ethan said. The man left. Agnes Fowler crossed to Charlotte and took her arm with the matter-of-fact ease of a woman who had escorted frightened people before. "Blue House," she said. "I made coffee. You look like you need it." Charlotte looked at her, this 70-year-old woman with her 2 years of careful notes and her carpet bag and her absolute unrattled certainty, and felt something loosen in her chest that had been wound tight for 3 days. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," Agnes said, briskly. Almost exactly the way Ethan had said it 2 days ago. Charlotte glanced at Ethan. He was watching the street, his hat back on, already calculating the next distance. "Is that a Red Creek expression?" she asked. Agnes made a sound that might have been a laugh. "It's a sensible one." The federal marshal arrived on the third afternoon. Thomas Hale was a lean man of 45 with a U.S. Marshal's badge that caught the light when he stepped off his horse outside Pruitt's jailhouse, and the particular purposeful energy of someone who had ridden hard because the telegraph he'd received had told him to. He had ridden from Cheyenne in 30 hours, which was fast by any measure, and which told Ethan everything he needed to know about whether Hale had taken the matter seriously. He had taken it seriously. Ethan met him outside the jailhouse and talked for 20 minutes, standing in the sun, and Charlotte watched from Agnes Fowler's front window, with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup and her heart in her throat. She watched Hale's face while Ethan talked. She had learned to read Ethan's face in 3 days, but Hale was a stranger, and she watched his face the way she watched ledger columns looking for the moment when the numbers either balanced or didn't. Hale's face balanced. He was nodding by the 10-minute mark, pulling out a notebook at 15. He and Ethan shook hands, and Hale walked into the jailhouse, and Ethan turned and looked directly at Agnes's front window, as though he had known exactly where Charlotte was the whole time. He tipped his hat. Just slightly. Just enough. She exhaled for what felt like the first time in 3 days. Agnes appeared at her shoulder with a fresh cup of coffee. "Well," she said. "Well," Charlotte agreed. "The marshal will want to speak to you. I know. Everything you told me this morning, the accounts, the column numbers, the dates, you'll need to say all of it again. Clearly, without hesitation." "I won't hesitate," Charlotte said. Agnes looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "No, I don't suppose you will." The twist that none of them had prepared for came at 4 o'clock 40 minutes before Charlotte was scheduled to speak to Marshal Hale. Daniel Gardner rode back into Red Creek not alone. Not with Martin Reeves on a second horse, but with a folded document in his breast pocket and a story that changed the shape of everything. Reeves had not been at the Central Hotel on 2nd Street. He had not been in Laramie at all. He had been in Red Creek for 6 days, not staying in the open, not at any hotel or boarding house, but in a rented room above the barber's shop on the west end of Maple Street, 400 yards from Agnes Fowler's front door. He had come back, Daniel said, because his conscience had followed him to Laramie and all the way back, and he had been trying to find a way to do what he knew he needed to do without getting himself killed for it. He had been in this town for 6 days. Waiting. When Daniel Gardner knocked on his door and told him that Charlotte Bennett had already named him, had already reconstructed the accounts from memory, had already given 3 days of her life to a fight she shouldn't have had. To fight alone. Martin Reeves had sat down on the edge of his rented bed and put his face in his hands and been quiet for a long time. Then he had picked up his hat. "Take me to whoever needs to hear this," he had said. Charlotte was at the window when Daniel Gardner came down Maple Street. She saw the second man with him, thin mid-40s, with the careful posture of someone trying not to be noticed, and she did not know his face. But she knew with the particular certainty of someone who had been building a case from incomplete evidence and suddenly sees the final piece, exactly who he was. She set down her coffee cup. "Agnes," she said. "I see him," Agnes said. From behind her. "He came back," Charlotte said. "People sometimes do," Agnes said, "when the right person decides to stop waiting for someone braver to go first." Charlotte turned around. Ethan was already coming through the front door. He had seen Daniel in the street, immediately was now standing in Agnes Fowler's front room, with his hat off and his eyes on Charlotte, and on his face was the expression she had seen only once before. The brief, unguarded look of a man who has made a promise and kept it, and is now allowing himself to feel what that costs and what it means. "Reeves is here," Ethan said. "I know," Charlotte said. "Hale will take his statement, combined with yours, with Agnes's records, with what Briggs documented about the blocked road." He stopped. "It's enough, Charlotte. It's more than enough." She looked at him. The afternoon light was going long through Agnes Fowler's front window, the same golden quality it had through the jailhouse window 2 days ago, but different here, warmer, less trapped. She was standing in a room that smelled of coffee and old paper and someone's lavender sachet, surrounded by the evidence that a 70-year-old postmistress and a grieving cowboy and a frightened bookkeeper and a young man who turned his horse around in the dark had built against one of the most powerful men in Wyoming territory. "Thank you," she said to Ethan, quietly. "The way you said things that were too large for the words available." He looked at her for a long moment. "You did most of it," he said. "We did it," she said. He didn't argue with that. Daniel Gardner knocked on Agnes Fowler's door, and Martin Reeves stood on the step behind him with his hat in both hands, and the late afternoon sun of Red Creek, Wyoming territory fell across all of them without particular ceremony. The truth, Charlotte thought, was like the light. It didn't care who it landed on. It just kept going until something stopped it. And the only question was whether the people in its path were going to step aside or stand still and let themselves be seen. She crossed the room and opened the door. Martin Reeves sat at Agnes Fowler's kitchen table and looked like a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and had only just put it down and was not yet sure his arms remembered how to hang normally. He was 46 thin in the way of men who forgot to eat when they were worried, and he had the careful, precise hands of someone who had spent 20 years handling other people's money and knew exactly what those hands had touched. Charlotte sat across from him. Ethan stood by the window. Agnes Fowler made coffee and did not pretend she wasn't listening to every word. "I knew about the second ledger," Reeves said. He said it the way people confessed things, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the flatness of someone who had rehearsed the sentence so many times it had worn smooth. "I knew about it for 14 months before I left." Charlotte kept her voice even. "And you said nothing." "I said nothing." He looked at his hands. "He came to me in February of last year, sat across from me the same way you're sitting now, and explained very calmly, very clearly, exactly what would happen if I made any of it public. He had documentation fabricated. I know that now, but convincing at the time, that would have placed the fraud on me. A forged signature on 2 of the altered accounts. My handwriting almost. Close enough." "He had you trapped," Charlotte said. "He had me trapped," Reeves agreed. "And yes, I made a choice that I am not proud of. I kept his books for another 8 months, and then I left because I couldn't keep doing it, and I couldn't stop it, and leaving felt like the only third option I had." "You went to Laramie," Ethan said from the window. "I went to Laramie. I told myself I would figure out what to do once I had distance from it, that I would find a way." He stopped. "I was in Laramie for 3 weeks before I came back." Charlotte looked at him sharply. "You've been in Red Creek for 6 days, she said. "Yes." "Why didn't you come forward?" Reeves looked up at her. His eyes had the reddened quality of a man who had not slept well in months. "Because I was afraid. Because I kept thinking, who is going to believe me against William Harrington? I have a forged signature with my name on it. He has 11 years of reputation in this county. I'm an office manager who ran away." He paused. "And then Daniel Gardner knocked on my door and told me what you had done. what you were doing. A seamstress with no legal standing and no money and no protection, who had walked into a jailhouse and stayed in it and kept fighting. His voice changed slightly, something quieter, something that was not quite shame, but was adjacent to it. I thought if she can do that, what exactly is my excuse? The kitchen was very quiet. Charlotte looked at him for a long moment. The forged signature, she said. Do you know where he keeps it? Reeves blinked. His private files, in the office. Same credenza. Second drawer on the left side. There's a manila envelope. Charlotte looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at her with the expression of a man performing a rapid calculation. Marshal Hale has authority to search the office, he said. With probable cause, she said. Reeves's testimony establishes probable cause. Combined with mine. Combined with yours and Agnes's records. He pushed off the window frame. I need to get Hale. He was out the door in 30 seconds. Agnes set a cup of coffee in front of Reeves without comment. He wrapped both hands around it. Miss Bennet, he said. Charlotte, she said. Charlotte. He looked at her with the particular directness of someone who had decided they were done with indirection. I'm going to tell Hale everything. Every number, every account, every conversation I had with Harrington. The forged signature, the altered records, all of it. A pause. It's going to complicate the case. Having me as a witness with what he has on me, Harrington's lawyers will use it. I know, Charlotte said. It might not be clean. Ethan told me that already. About a different part of it. She met his eyes. Tell the truth, Mr. Reeves. The whole truth, including the parts that don't reflect well on you. Because the only thing that breaks a story like Harrington's is when the people he trapped decide they'd rather be honest about what happened than comfortable about what they allowed. Reeves looked at her for a long time. You're not what I expected, he said. What did you expect? Someone more frightened. I'm terrified, Charlotte said evenly. I've been terrified for 4 days, but terror and action aren't mutually exclusive. My father taught me that, and it's possibly the only useful thing he ever said. Agnes from the counter made a sound that was definitely a laugh this time. Hale took Reeves's statement in the back room of Agnes's house with the door closed and a notebook open, and the focused, unhurried attention of a federal marshal who understood that the quality of the record mattered as much as the content. He was in there for 2 hours. Charlotte sat in Agnes's front room and listened to the muffled sound of Reeves's voice going steadily, not stopping, not breaking, and she thought about the forged signature in Harrington's second drawer, and what it meant that Harrington had prepared it 14 months ago. He had been preparing for exactly this. The thought was chilling and clarifying simultaneously. He had anticipated exposure. He had built a contingency. He had wrapped his own bookkeeper in manufactured evidence and kept him working and kept him silent and had a backup accusation ready to deploy if the primary one failed. The machinery was more sophisticated than even she had estimated. She said this to Ethan, who had come back inside and was sitting across from her with his coffee gone cold. Yes, he said. Which means he's been doing this longer than the 5 years of accounts you saw. Those were just the records he was careless enough to have in one place. Charlotte stared at him. How much longer? I don't know. Hale's office will. Once they start pulling on this thread. He stopped. It's going to be bigger than Red Creek, Charlotte. When this is over, when Hale files his report, this is going to reach into the state commissioner's office. Possibly further. She absorbed this. The families, she said quietly. How many families? A lot, Ethan said. Just that. Knowing that the number behind the word was large enough that putting it in precise terms right now would be its own kind of cruelty. She nodded. All right, she said. Then let's make sure we do it right. Harrington moved at 7 o'clock that evening. Not carefully. Not with the patient architecture of his previous moves. He moved the way powerful men moved when they felt the ground shifting under them fast and hard, and slightly less calculated than usual, which was both more dangerous and more revealing. He came to Agnes Fowler's house himself. This surprised everyone, including Ethan, who had been expecting another proxy, another Corcoran, another Harlan, another letter from another official. But Harrington came in person, and he came with 2 lawyers and 3 armed men, and the particular bearing of a man who had decided that the time for managing this quietly was over. Charlotte heard the knock on Agnes's front door, and felt the quality of it firm, deliberate the knock of someone who expected it to be opened immediately. Agnes opened it. William Harrington was 58 years old, and looked like money, not ostentation, but the deep-grained, settled look of someone who had lived with wealth so long it had become biological. He was tall, silver-haired, with a face that had been handsome and was now distinguished, and eyes that were the particular shade of gray that suggested precision. He looked at Agnes Fowler for precisely 1 second, which was all the time he allotted her. Then he looked past her to the room beyond, and his eyes found Charlotte immediately. "Miss Bennet," he said, "I'd like a word." "Mr. Harrington," Charlotte said. She did not stand. She had thought about this, whether to stand, whether the standing would be deference or defiance, and had decided that staying seated was the cleaner statement. "I believe any words between us at this point should be said in front of Marshal Hale." Harrington's expression did not change. It was a disciplined face. "Where is the marshal?" "In the back room," she said, taking a statement. Something moved in Harrington's eyes, a rapid recalculation quickly suppressed. "Whose statement?" Charlotte looked at him steadily and said nothing. The silence told him. She watched it land. Watched the small, precise shift in his posture. Not collapse. Nothing so satisfying as collapse. But the adjustment of a man who had just been told his contingency had failed and was already moving to the next calculation. "Martin was confused about a great many things," Harrington said. His voice was still pleasant. Still the voice of a man explaining something unfortunate and correctable. "His records were disorganized. He made errors. He made a statement," Charlotte said, "under oath, to a federal marshal. Miss Bennet." He stepped inside without being invited, and his lawyers followed him, and his 3 armed men stayed on the porch because Agnes Fowler, 70 years old, 5 feet 2 inches with a carpetbag over one arm, had not moved from the doorway and was simply standing in it in a way that communicated without any particular drama that she was not planning to. Harrington looked at Charlotte with the expression of a man who had decided to stop being pleasant and had not yet decided what to replace it with. "You are a seamstress," he said. "You have no legal standing. You have no lawyer. You have no money for a lawyer. What you have is a set of numbers you claim to have memorized from documents you had no authorization to examine, and the word of a disgraced former employee who left this county under a cloud of his own making. And 2 years of correspondence records from the Red Creek post office," Agnes said from the doorway, pleasantly. Harrington did not look at her. "And a federal marshal in the next room," Ethan said from the hallway. Now Harrington looked. He looked at Ethan with the specific attention of a man reassessing a threat he had previously underestimated. "Callahan," he said. "Harrington," Ethan said. The 2 men looked at each other across Agnes Fowler's front room, and Charlotte watched it, the specific charge of 2 people who had been on opposite sides of something for a long time, finally being in the same room about it. "This isn't your fight," Harrington said. "I've been making it my fight for 8 months, Ethan said. "Reckon that makes it my fight. You have nothing concrete. I have 3 families who can testify to debt manipulation on federal land grants. I have a telegraph record showing I contacted the marshal's office before any of this became public. And I have a woman who walked into your office to repair your furniture and came out with a memory that is about to end your career." He met Harrington's eyes without heat, without anger, with the same steady level attention that had held a crowd of 41 people at bay in the town square. "We have you, William, all of it, all the way down." Harrington was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned to his lawyers. What passed between them was too low for Charlotte to hear 3 sentences quick and clipped, and then one of the lawyers stepped forward and held out a folded document. "My client," the lawyer said, "is prepared to offer a settlement, full repayment of the disputed amounts to the relevant account holders, a restructuring of all outstanding loans to their original contracted terms, and a substantial payment to Miss Bennet for her inconvenience." Charlotte looked at the document without touching it. "And the criminal charges," she said. The lawyer glanced at Harrington. "My client would require as a condition of settlement that the matter be handled civilly rather than criminally." given the complexity of the accounting and the potential for misinterpretation. "No," Charlotte said. The room was very still. "Miss Bennett," the lawyer said, "I want to make sure you understand the scope of what's being offered here. Full restitution. Complete." "I understand the scope," Charlotte said. "My answer is no." She looked past the lawyer to Harrington. "The families in your ledgers weren't just cheated out of money, Mr. Harrington. They were frightened. They were manipulated. They made decisions, sold land, pulled children out of school, worked themselves sick because of numbers you invented. A civil settlement pays them back the money. It doesn't account for the rest of it." She paused. "And it doesn't account for what you did to me." Harrington's face had gone through several things in rapid succession and had settled on something she had not expected. Not anger, not contempt, but a kind of cold, precise fury that was somehow more honest than his pleasantness had been. "You are making a serious mistake," he said. "You told me that in the jailhouse," Charlotte said, "through Corcoran. You also told me that through the transfer order, and through the blocked road, and the forged signature, and the 15 men who walked me out of my cell on Tuesday." She met his eyes. "I've been making this mistake consistently for 4 days. I don't see any reason to stop now." The back door opened. Marshal Hale came out with his notebook closed and his badge catching the evening light and the expression of a man who had heard everything he needed to hear and was now done with the preliminary stages of the process. He looked at Harrington. "Mr. Harrington," he said, "I'm going to need you to come with me." The arrest was not dramatic. That was the thing that stayed with Charlotte afterward, how ordinary it was. No struggle, no shouting, no grand confrontation. Harrington's lawyers objected formally and at length, and Hale listened to them with the patience of a man who had heard lawyers object before and had not yet found it prevented him from doing his job. The 3 armed men on the porch were asked to stand down, and they did, because federal marshals occupied a category of authority that even men on Harrington's payroll understood was different in kind from sheriff's deputies and county commissioners. Harrington walked out of Agnes Fowler's house with his hands at his sides and his chin level and the bearing of a man who had decided that dignity at least was still available to him. At the door he stopped. He looked back at Charlotte, one long look, the kind that was meant to carry a message, and the message was clear enough. "This isn't finished. I have resources you don't. This is not over." Charlotte held his gaze. "It is over," she said quietly. Not with triumph, just with the flat certainty of someone reading a number that doesn't lie. Harrington walked out. Agnes closed the door behind him with a gentle final click. The room exhaled. The circuit judge arrived the following morning, not 4 days after the arrest, which was what the original schedule had allowed for, but 26 hours after Hale filed his federal report. Because when a federal marshal requested expedited proceedings in a fraud case involving land grants, judges moved faster than their usual schedule suggested. His name was Aldous Pierce, and he was 63 years old and small and precise, and completely unimpressed by anyone's reputation, which Charlotte recognized immediately as the single most valuable quality a judge could have. He reviewed Hale's report. He reviewed Charlotte's written account. He reviewed Reeves's statement and Agnes Fowler's 2 years of correspondence records. He reviewed the photographs that Hale's deputy had taken of the contents of Harrington's credenza, the second set of accounts, the manila envelope with the forged signature, everything exactly where Charlotte had said it would be. He reviewed it all in 3 hours. Then he asked Charlotte to come in. She sat across from Judge Pierce in Pruitt's jailhouse, which had been converted for the purposes of the proceedings into the closest thing Red Creek had to a formal hearing room, and she answered every question he asked. She answered them the way she did everything, methodically, precisely, without embellishment, starting with what she knew and staying there, not speculating, not editorializing. Just the facts laid out in the order they occurred with the specific figures attached. At one point, Pierce stopped her. "Miss Bennett," he said, "you said you memorized these accounts over the course of 2 working days." "Yes, Your Honor." "All of them? The complete second ledger?" "Yes." He looked at her over his reading glasses. "That's an unusual capacity." "My father was a bookkeeper," she said. "He said numbers were just stories with the words taken out. You remember a story by understanding it, not by reciting it. Once I understood what those accounts were saying, what they meant, I couldn't have forgotten them if I'd tried. Pierce was quiet for a moment. He wrote something in his notebook. "Miss Bennett," he said, "were you aware when you reported the missing evidence to Sheriff Pruitt that you had already been formally accused by Mr. Harrington?" "Yes." "And you reported it anyway?" "Yes." "Why?" She had thought about this question. She had known someone would eventually ask it, and she had thought about what the honest answer was. Not the dignified one, not the heroic one, the true one. "Because there were 42 families in those accounts," she said. "And I had seen their names, and I knew their debt wasn't real. And I thought if I stay quiet to protect myself, those families pay a fake debt for the rest of their lives, and I spend the rest of my life knowing I could have said something and didn't." She paused. "I've watched people make that choice, to stay quiet, to protect themselves. I've seen what it does to them. I didn't want to become that." Pierce wrote something else. "Thank you, Miss Bennett," he said. The verdict, or rather the formal determination of charges, since a full trial would follow in the federal court in Cheyenne, came down at 2 o'clock that afternoon. Harrington was formally charged with fraud, extortion, conspiracy to obstruct justice, and this was the one Charlotte had not anticipated: attempted perversion of the course of justice, which covered the manufactured theft accusation, the transfer order, the blocked road, the forged signature, and the unauthorized removal of a prisoner from lawful custody. Deputy Harlan was charged separately with assault on a law officer and abuse of official position. Howe was 23 years old, and Pruitt, in his formal report, had noted that Harlan had stepped back from his holster before any physical intervention was necessary, and had included this in the written record without editorial comment, which Charlotte thought was the most precise form of mercy available to a man in Pruitt's position. Corcoran was not charged. He had been acting legally as a private citizen who had done something monstrous, but the law was not yet in the business of charging people for things that were monstrous, rather than technically criminal. And Charlotte had made her peace with this imperfect reality over the 3 hours she had spent answering Pierce's questions. She had expected the verdict to feel large. She had expected something that matched the weight of the past 4 days. Something loud or bright or conclusively different from everything that had come before. What she felt instead was a great still quiet, like a ledger that finally balanced. The column of everything owed against the column of everything that had actually happened, and the two numbers finally, after days of living in the gap between them, meeting. She sat on the steps of Agnes Fowler's house and let the afternoon settle around her. Ethan came and sat beside her. Not close enough to be presumptuous, close enough to be present. "How do you feel?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "Tired," she said, "like something very heavy has been put down, and I can still feel the weight of it in my arms, even though I'm not holding it anymore." He nodded. "That lasts a while." "Have you felt it?" "After my brother's case was finally reopened," he said, 6 years after. The man who had accused him was found out in a different county, and the record was corrected posthumously. He paused. Posthumously. She heard the word land in his throat on the way out. The way certain words did not from softness, but from the opposite, from the pressure of something held very precisely. "I'm sorry," she said, quietly. Not as ceremony, as the real thing. "It's why this mattered," he said. "Getting it right while it could still help someone." She looked at. The late afternoon light was doing the same thing it had done through the jailhouse window, the same golden quality. But this time, there were no bars between her and it. "It helped me," she said. He looked at her, and there it was again, that thing she had been learning to read over 4 days, that small, precise shift that happened in his face when something got past the careful levelness he maintained, when something reached the person underneath the steadiness. "I know," he said. She looked at the street, the town going about its business. Several people who had been in that crowd 2 days ago, who had watched Corcoran lead her toward a hitching post with a rope, now walking the same street with the same ordinary faces, going to the same stores, buying the same provisions. "Do you think they feel it?" she asked. "The people who were in the crowd, what they almost let happen. Some of them do," Ethan said. Some of them will tell it differently later, the way memory does, softening the parts that make a person look bad. And some won't think about it much. That's the harder truth. Most people aren't villains, and they aren't heroes. They're just people who go along with things, and live with what they went along with, and don't examine it too carefully. That seems lonely, Charlotte said. Yes, he agreed. It does. She thought about that for a moment. Agnes is staying for supper, she said. She made a point of telling me. Agnes makes a point of most things. She said you're invited too. A pause. She also said, and I'm quoting, that you had better show up because she has been tolerating your company for years, and it was time you were useful at a dinner table. Something happened to Ethan's face. The almost smile from earlier, the one that had changed his face in a way that was difficult not to look at, came back, and this time it completed itself. It was a real smile. Full and unguarded the way hers had been in the jailhouse when she realized what he had put in motion. And it lasted only a moment before the habitual steadiness reasserted itself. But that moment was enough for Charlotte to understand something she had been assembling without quite naming for the past 4 days. She looked back at the street. I don't know what happens now, she said, meaning practically, meaning her room above the tailor shop, her work, her life in Red Creek after a week that had remade every relationship she had in it. You're a witness in a federal case, Ethan said. Hale will want you available. That means Red Creek for a while longer. And after? He was quiet. I don't know, he said. What do you want to do after? She had not thought about after in 4 days. After had seemed like a category that required surviving the current thing first, and the current thing had occupied all available space. I want to work, she said. I'm good at numbers. I've been doing sewing because it was available and I needed the money, but what I'm actually good at is accounts. She paused. There are going to be a lot of families in this county who need their books straightened out, who need someone to go through what they actually owe and separate it from what Harrington told them they owed. Ethan looked at her. That's true, he said. That seems like useful work, she said. It seems like necessary work, he agreed. She looked at him. Your ranch, she said. Do you have anyone who handles your books? He was quiet for a moment. No, he said. Is that something you'd need? Another pause. Longer this time. The careful kind. It might be, he said. She nodded slowly, not committing to anything. Not yet. Just noting the possibility and leaving it where it could be found again later when there was more room for it. Supper, she said. Supper, he agreed. They sat for another moment in the late afternoon side by side on Agnes Fowler's front step, and the town moved around them, and somewhere down the street, Pruitt was filing paperwork with his wrapped arm and his daughter's name in his chest, and somewhere Martin Reeves was sitting with the lighter weight of a man who has finally put down the thing he should have put down a year ago. And somewhere the Gardner boys were riding home to tell their father that the numbers in his debt agreement were about to change. Charlotte pressed her palms flat against her knees. They were completely steady. They had been steady for a while now, she realized. She hadn't noticed exactly when it happened, when the trembling had stopped and the steadiness had taken its place. That was how those things worked. You didn't feel yourself becoming different. You just looked down one day and found that your hands had learned something your mind had been teaching them. She stood up. I'm going to wash my face, she said, and change my dress, and then I am going to sit at Agnes Fowler's dinner table and eat a proper meal. And tomorrow I am going to find myself a lawyer and figure out what my legal standing actually is in all of this. You have standing, Ethan said. You're the primary witness in a federal fraud case. That's considerable standing. I want to know precisely what it means. She looked at him. Can you recommend someone? I know a man in Cheyenne, he said. Honest. Good with federal procedure. Write me his name tonight. Yes. She nodded. She turned toward Agnes's front door. Charlotte, Ethan said. She turned back. He was looking at her with that face, the open one, the one that appeared rarely and briefly, and with the specific quality of someone who had learned to keep things close and was making a deliberate choice not to. What you said to Harrington, he said. When he looked back at you, you told him it was over. Yes. Were you sure? She thought about it honestly. No, she said. I was not sure. I knew it wasn't finished, and he knew it wasn't finished, and I said it the way you say things that you need to be true, not because they are yet, but because saying them out loud gives them somewhere to stand. He was quiet for a moment. Then, that's the bravest kind of statement there is. She held his gaze. I learned it from watching someone fire a rifle into an afternoon sky, she said, and then walk forward like the answer to 41 people was just a matter of deciding to. The almost smile came back. This time she let herself really look at it. Go wash your face, he said. Agnes will start without us. She went inside, and behind her, Ethan Callahan sat on the step a moment longer and looked at the street of Red Creek, Wyoming Territory in the summer of 1882, and felt something move in his chest that he had not felt in a very long time, something that had no useful name in the vocabulary of a man who had spent 7 years being careful about what he allowed himself to want. He put his hat on. He stood up. He went inside for supper. Agnes Fowler's supper table seated 6 people comfortably and 8 people, if nobody minded their elbows, and that night it seated 7. Charlotte, Ethan, Agnes herself, Martin Reeves, James Gardner, Pruitt, and a man named Walt Briggs, who had ridden a blocked road and come back without complaint, and apparently considered himself owed a meal for the trouble which Agnes had agreed with immediately and without qualification. They ate beef stew and cornbread and a dried apple pie that Agnes produced from somewhere in her kitchen with the matter-of-fact confidence of a woman who had been feeding people through difficult circumstances for decades. Nobody talked about the case. Nobody talked about Harrington or the charges or the federal proceedings in Cheyenne. They talked about the Gardner Ranch's winter wheat and whether the south pasture would hold for another season, and about Briggs's horse, who was apparently named Senator, and had opinions about being ridden hard on short notice, and about the apple harvest expected in September. Charlotte sat between Ethan and Agnes and ate 2 full portions of stew and did not apologize for it because she had not eaten a real meal in 4 days, and her body was making its requirements very clear. At one point Pruitt, who had been quiet through most of dinner, set down his fork and looked at the table generally and said, I wrote Ruth a letter today. Told her the school money was coming. Didn't say how exactly. Nobody asked him to elaborate. Good, Agnes said. Just that. Pruitt picked up his fork again. Ethan beside Charlotte was quiet in the way he was always quiet, not absent, not disengaged, but contained. Present in the particular way of someone who had learned to take up exactly the space required, and no more. She was aware of him the way she had been aware of him since the first moment in the square, as a fact of the room, something reliable and specific that oriented everything around it. After dinner, when the others had gone, and Agnes was washing dishes with the focused efficiency of a woman who trusted nobody else to do it correctly, Charlotte stood at the kitchen doorway and looked at Ethan, who was putting on his hat. Where are you staying? She asked. Dolan still, he said. For now. How long is for now? He looked at her steadily. As long as this needs. She held his gaze. The federal proceedings could take months. I know. You have a ranch. It'll keep, he said. James Gardner's boys have been checking on it. I arranged that this morning. She looked at him. You arranged that before you knew how today would go. I arranged it before I knew how yesterday would go, he said. Some things you plan for because the alternative is not having planned. She was quiet for a moment. Ethan, she said. You came into this town for your own reasons. 8 months of watching Harrington. You had your own case you were building. Yes, and then I fell into the middle of it. You didn't fall into it, he said. You went into his office and opened a credenza drawer and found what I had spent 8 months looking for from the outside. You did in 2 days what I couldn't do in 8 months. He paused. I didn't save you, Charlotte. I just made sure you had time to save yourself. She absorbed this. That's not entirely true, she said. It's mostly true, he said. Agnes from the sink said without turning around. It's both true. Say good night, Ethan. A sound came from Ethan that was somewhere between a breath and a laugh. Good night, Charlotte. Good night, she said. He went out. Agnes handed Charlotte a dish towel. "Well," Agnes said. "Please don't," Charlotte said. "I wasn't going to say anything," Agnes said with the expression of a woman who had been about to say several things. They washed the dishes in companionable silence, and outside the summer night settled over Red Creek and Charlotte Bennett, who had come to this town 3 years ago with a sewing kit and her father's head for numbers, and the modest ambition of being left alone, stood in a 70-year-old woman's kitchen and felt the particular fragile, unexpected quality of a life that was still in her own hands. She held the dish towel and was careful with it. The weeks that followed had their own momentum separate from the acute drama of the previous days, but no less demanding. Hale's federal investigation expanded, as Ethan had predicted, well beyond Red Creek. By the end of the first week, 3 additional counties were involved. By the end of the second, a territorial commissioner's aide had been placed on administrative leave pending review of his correspondence with Harrington's legal team. The files that Charlotte had reconstructed from memory and that Hale's deputy had photographed in Harrington's credenza became the foundation of a federal case that the U.S. Attorney in Cheyenne described in a letter to the Marshal's office as one of the most systematically documented instances of rural land fraud he had encountered in 11 years of territorial law. He used the phrase "documented" with unusual precision. Hale showed Charlotte the letter. She read it twice and handed it back without comment. "Unusual precision," Hale said with the dry appreciation of a man who recognized the phrase for what it was. "My father's words," Charlotte said. "Not mine." She had said that before about her father, about the bookkeeper's memory, about the skill that had arrived without warmth and been useful anyway. She had been saying it since the first night in the cell, as though repetition would settle something about it that was still unsettled. The truth was more complicated than she usually let herself examine. Her father had been a difficult man who taught a useful skill to a daughter. He mostly regarded as an extension of his own competence, and what she had done with that skill was entirely hers, and the gap between those two facts was where she actually lived. She was thinking about this when Ethan came to find her at the telegraph office where she had been sending and receiving messages on behalf of the federal proceedings for 3 days, having established herself as the most efficient person in Red Creek for the purpose. "Reeves is leaving for Cheyenne tomorrow," he said. "Hale wants him close to the attorney's office." "I know. He told me this morning. Charlotte." He stopped. Something in his voice had the quality of a man approaching a thing he had been approaching carefully for some time. "Hale asked me today if you'd be willing to go to Cheyenne, as a formal consultant to the proceedings. Your knowledge of the accounts he wants you available when the defense starts disputing the numbers." She looked up from the telegraph desk. "A consultant," she said. "Paid," Ethan said. "Federally. It's not a large amount, but it's—" "I'll go," she said. He blinked. "You didn't want time to think about it." "I've been thinking about it since the second day in the cell," she said. The moment Hale walked into Agnes's back room, I understood that this was going to be bigger than Red Creek, and that someone who knew the accounts in detail was going to be essential for as long as the proceedings lasted. She set down her pencil. "I was waiting for someone to formally ask." Ethan looked at her for a long moment. "You could have asked," he said. "I know," she said. "But it's better when they ask. It means they understand why they need it." He absorbed this. "Cheyenne," he said. "Cheyenne," she confirmed. "I'll be coming back through Cheyenne on my way home to the ranch," he said. It was offered carefully, neutrally, with the particular restraint of a man who had learned to offer things in such a way that they could be declined without damage. She looked at him. "How long will you be in Cheyenne?" "Depends on how long you need someone who knows the South Road," he said. She held his gaze. "I might need that for a while," she said. The restraint in his face eased by exactly 1 degree, which on Ethan Callahan's face was equivalent to most men's full expression. "Then I'll plan accordingly," he said. They left Red Creek on a Thursday morning, 8 days after the arrest. The send-off was not ceremonial. Agnes Fowler did not do ceremony, and Charlotte had spent enough time in her company to have absorbed some of this, but it was genuine, which was better. Agnes pressed Charlotte's hands between both of hers and said, "Write me. Not just about the case, about the rest of it. Charlotte had nodded. She understood what the rest of it meant. Pruitt shook Charlotte's hand on the steps of the jailhouse, his own jailhouse properly, his again, now that Harlan had been formally removed from his position pending the separate proceedings. His wrapped arm had been replaced with a clean bandage, and he was moving it more freely. "Miss Bennett," he said. "Thank you." Just that. She did not ask him to say more because what he had said contained everything. James Gardner came with his brother Daniel, both on horseback, to see them off. Daniel, who had ridden the South Pass in the dark and knocked on a frightened man's door and brought him back, shook Charlotte's hand with the direct grip of someone who had done something real and knew it. "If you ever need the South Road ridden again," he said, "you know where to find us." Martin Reeves was already on the Cheyenne stage, which left an hour before them. Charlotte had said goodbye to him the previous evening in Agnes's front room, and he had said the kind of things that a man says when he has finally stopped managing his guilt and started living inside the truth of what he'd allowed and what he'd eventually corrected. She had listened without diminishing it and without inflating it, and when he finished, she said, "Keep the records clean, Mr. Reeves. That's all anybody can do from here." He had nodded like a man receiving instruction he intended to follow. The road to Cheyenne was 2 days by horse, 4 by stage, and they were taking horses because Ethan had 2, and the stage made him restless in a way he had explained once and not elaborated on. They rode out of Red Creek in the early morning, and Charlotte did not look back. She had thought she might have half expected some pull of sentiment toward the town she had lived in for 3 years. The streets she had walked, the room above the tailor shop where she had done honest work and caused no trouble, and believed that was enough. But what she felt instead was forward-facing. What she felt was the road opening. They rode for an hour before either of them spoke, which was comfortable in a way she had not expected comfort to feel. Not the absence of things to say, but the presence of a silence that didn't require filling. Ethan broke it first. "Tell me something," he said. "Something I don't know yet." She glanced at him. "About what?" "Anything. You've been in Red Creek 3 years. I've been watching that town for 8 months. I know the public record. Tell me something that isn't in the public record." She thought about it. "There's a woman named Clara Hess," she said, "who lives on the eastern edge of town and has been altering the records at the land registry for 2 years. Ethan turned his head sharply. "Not for Harrington," Charlotte said quickly. "For herself. She's been quietly correcting clerical errors, genuine errors, mistakes made when the original surveys were filed that would have lost 3 small homesteaders their legal title. She has no authority to do it. She's been doing it anyway." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "You know this how?" "She brings her mending to me. We talk." Charlotte paused. "I didn't report it because what she was doing was technically illegal and actually right, and I couldn't find a way to make those 2 things fit into the same report." He looked at her. "You had good instincts about that." "I had complicated instincts about that," she said. "Good and complicated are not always the same thing." "No," he agreed. "They're not." They rode in silence for a while after that. The road was dry, and the sky was the hard blue of a Wyoming summer morning, and somewhere ahead of them was Cheyenne and the federal attorney's office, and the next stage of something that was much larger than either of them, and would take much longer than either of them had planned for. She was not frightened of that. She noticed this, the specific absence of the fear that had been with her for 8 days, the way you noticed a sound only when it stopped. The fear had been so constant that its absence felt almost physical, like a weight removed from her shoulders that she had stopped counting as weight because she had been carrying it so long. Her hands on the reins were steady. They had been steady for days. They stopped at midday to rest the horses at a creek crossing, and while the horses drank, Ethan sat on a flat rock and looked at the water, and Charlotte stood beside him and did the same, and after a while he said without preamble, "My brother's name was Samuel." She went very still. "How was 29?" Ethan said. "Younger than me by 6 years. He had a small ranch in Lincoln County. A man named Caswell wanted his water rights. There was a creek that ran through Samuel's land that Caswell needed for his operation. Samuel wouldn't sell." He paused. "Caswell accused him of stealing cattle, Manufactured witnesses. The kind of thing you build in a county where you own the sheriff. Another pause. Samuel was convicted in 3 days. He died in the prison at Santa Fe 8 months later of a chest illness that would have been treatable if anyone had bothered to treat it. Charlotte listened. She did not say she was sorry again because she had said it once, and it had been true then, and nothing had changed about its truth. But saying it again would have been about her discomfort rather than his grief, and she understood the difference. The man who accused him, Ethan said. Caswell. He still has the ranch. He still has the water rights. Samuel's land was sold at auction after his death for 1/4 of its value. Caswell bought it. He looked at the water. The case was reviewed last year, posthumously. The conviction was overturned. It's in the record now. He was quiet for a moment. Samuel isn't. Charlotte sat down on the rock beside him. Is that why you stayed? She asked. In Red Creek, after. It would have been easier to go once Hale arrived. Yes, he said. For Samuel, she said. For Samuel, he said. And he stopped. She waited. For the other reason, he said. The one I don't need to explain because you already know it. She looked at him. Howe was looking at the water, not at her, and his face had the open quality that appeared rarely and briefly, the one that meant he was choosing honesty over the habitual restraint. And she looked at it with the same careful, precise attention she brought to everything that mattered. I know it, she said quietly. He nodded once. Neither of them said anything else about it. There was no need. They were both people who understood that some things were more solidly established by acknowledgement than by elaboration, and that the space between two people who had decided to trust each other was not empty but full, and that filling it with words was sometimes just noise. They sat by the creek until the horses were ready, and then they rode on toward Cheyenne. The twist came on the second day. They were 6 hours from Cheyenne on the high road above the valley when they met a rider coming south. A federal courier, it turned out, with a dispatch for Marshal Hale that he was carrying back to Red Creek, having found nobody at the marshal's office in Cheyenne to receive it. Ethan flagged him down. The courier, who recognized Callahan's name, handed over the dispatch without significant objection. Ethan read it. His face did not change in the way most people's faces changed when they received significant news. It did the other thing. The thing Charlotte had learned to watch for, the small, precise tightening that meant something large was being processed. He handed her the dispatch. She read it. It was from the U.S. Attorney's Office in Cheyenne, addressed to Hale, marked urgent. It contained 3 pieces of information. The first was that Harrington's lead attorney had filed a motion to suppress the evidence from the credenza search, arguing procedural irregularities in the warrant. The second was that the motion had been denied. The third was that William Harrington, in response to the denial, had formally agreed to cooperate with the federal investigation in exchange for a reduced charge on 2 of the 6 counts against him, and that his cooperation had already produced the names of 4 additional individuals in the territorial government who had been facilitating the fraud for a percentage of the proceeds. Charlotte read this 3 times. He's giving up his partners, she said. Yes, Ethan said. To protect himself. To protect what he can still protect. He took the dispatch back. It means the case gets bigger, and it means Harrington survives some of this. She felt the specific cold of that, the imperfect reality, the one she had made her peace with in Pierce's improvised hearing room, and was now being asked to make her peace with again. He still faces 4 counts, she said. Yes. Fraud and extortion don't reduce easily. The mandatory minimums. He'll serve time, Ethan said. Not everything he deserves, but time. She handed the dispatch back. The 4 names he gave up, she said, in the territorial government. Yes, that's bigger than him, she said. That's what breaks the system he was operating inside, because he wasn't just doing this in a vacuum. He needed people who would look the other way, who would approve transfers and sign orders and make sure county records said what they needed to say. She looked at Ethan. Those 4 names are worth more than his conviction on all 6 counts. He looked at her. You're not wrong, he said. I'm not happy about it, she said. I want to be clear that I am not happy about it, but I'm not wrong. No, he said. You're not. She straightened in her saddle. "All right," she said. "Let's get to Cheyenne." The federal attorney's name was James Whitmore, and he was 41 and thin and moved very fast through his own office, which was organized in a way that appeared chaotic and was apparently, according to his clerk, a precise system that only Whitmore understood. He shook Charlotte's hand when Ethan introduced her and then immediately said, "The credenza accounts. You memorized them." "Yes," she said. "All 12 months." "Yes. The defense is going to argue that memory is unreliable, that you reconstructed them after the fact based on partial knowledge and filled in the gaps with speculation." "They're welcome to argue that," Charlotte said. "And then you can ask them to explain why every figure I provided matches the photographed documents exactly, including the error in the October column where Harrington's bookkeeper transposed 2 digits and corrected it in the margin in a different ink." Whitmore stopped moving. "You remember a margin correction," he said. "October 14th, she said. "The Pendleton account. The corrected figure is $47.60. The original transposition read $47.16. The correction is in darker ink applied later, and the handwriting is slightly smaller, which suggests it was added under time pressure." Whitmore looked at her. Then he looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at the wall with the expression of someone who was not going to say "I told you" out loud. "Miss Bennett," Whitmore said, "I would like you to start from the beginning." She sat down in the chair across from his desk. She started from the beginning. The trial lasted 3 weeks in Cheyenne and produced 42 pages of testimony, the longest single witness examination in the territorial court's recent record, most of it Charlotte's. Harrington's defense attempted on 4 separate occasions to shake her numbers. Each time she answered with the specific figure, the specific date, the specific account, the specific correction in the margin, or the specific fee, with no corresponding receipt. And each time, the defense attorney sat back down with the look of a man who had just pushed against something he had expected to give way, and found it didn't. On the 3rd day during a recess, Whitmore stopped beside her in the corridor and said simply, "Where did you learn to do that?" "My father," she said. "How was a good teacher?" She thought about her father, the impatience, the precision, the coldness, the bookkeeper's absolute conviction that numbers told a story that people couldn't lie about, even when they lied about everything else. "He was a difficult man who was very good at one thing," she said. "I took the one thing." Whitmore nodded like a man who understood exactly what that meant. "We're going to win this," he said. "I know," she said, not with arrogance, with the flat certainty of someone reading a ledger that balanced. Ethan stayed in Cheyenne for 3 weeks. He had not planned to. His ranch needed him. Senator needed to go home, and he was not a man built for cities, even small territorial ones. But he stayed because Charlotte was in that courthouse every day, and the courthouse was in Cheyenne, and some calculations made themselves. Howe was in the corridor outside the courtroom when she came out on the last day of her testimony. She walked out with the steady, even stride she had developed, or that he had watched develop day by day over the weeks since Red Creek, and she found him immediately in the corridor, the way she always found him, with the particular precision of someone who had learned where to look. "Done," she said. "Done," he agreed. "Whitmore says closing arguments next week. Verdict likely before the end of the month." "And then," she looked at him, "and then I go back to Red Creek. There are 42 families with fraudulent account books that need to be corrected, and Whitmore's office has formally requested that I serve as the county's independent account auditor for the recalculation process." She paused. "It's a paid position." "I heard," he said. "You heard. Whitmore mentioned it when he asked me to carry the letter to Hale last week." She looked at him steadily. "You didn't tell me." "I wanted to see how you'd say it," he said. She let out a breath that was not quite exasperation and not quite a laugh. "Ethan Callahan," she said, "you are a deeply infuriating man." "So I've been told," he said with the almost smile. "Usually by Agnes." She looked at him for a long moment. "I'm going back to Red Creek," she said. "Yes. Your ranch is outside Red Creek." 8 miles south, he said, past the creek crossing. "I know where it is," she said. I've heard you describe the South Road enough times." He was quiet. He was looking at her with that face, the open one, the one she had learned over weeks, and still wasn't entirely prepared for when it arrived. "Charlotte," he said. "Yes," she said, before he finished, before he said whatever careful, restrained, precisely offered thing he had been building toward. He looked at her. "You don't know what I was going to say," he said. "I know exactly what you were going to say," she said. "You were going to offer something in the particular way you offer things, carefully, with room for me to decline, neutrally worded, so that if I said no, we could both pretend it was a logistical suggestion and not what it actually was." His expression was remarkable. She had never seen him look surprised before. It was, she decided, a very good look on him. "Was I that obvious?" he said. "To me," she said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "And your answer," he said, "is yes." "My answer," she said, "is yes. With the understanding that I am an independent woman who is about to have a paid federal appointment, and who will be making her own decisions and keeping her own books, and does not require rescuing." "I am aware of that," he said. "I have been aware of that since the second day in the jailhouse." "And you're not bothered by it?" "Charlotte," he said, "I walked into a square full of people who wanted to hurt you, and I fired a rifle into the sky and stood my ground because I saw a woman who was telling the truth and fighting for it alone. The last thing in the world I would do is ask that woman to be anything other than exactly what she is." She looked at him for a long time. The courthouse corridor was not a romantic setting. It smelled of old wood and legal documents and the particular dry heat of a Cheyenne summer, and there were clerks passing with their arms full of papers, and somewhere a door was banging in the wind, and none of it was the kind of backdrop that appeared in the stories women told about the moment everything changed. It was the truth, which was better. "All right," she said. "All right," he agreed. He offered her his arm. She took it. They walked out of the courthouse into the Cheyenne afternoon, and the sun was the same hard Wyoming blue it had been on the morning they left Red Creek, and ahead of them was the road back, and behind them was everything that had made that road possible. The verdict came 12 days later, guilty on 3 of 4 remaining counts. The fourth, the most technical, the one the defense had built its case around, was reduced to a lesser charge. Whitmore accepted it without complaint, because 3 counts with mandatory minimums meant Harrington was going to spend years answering for what he had done, and the 4 names he had given the federal government were already producing their own separate proceedings, which would take down a network that had been operating in Wyoming territory for longer than anyone had yet fully mapped. Charlotte received the news by telegraph at Agnes Fowler's house, where she had been for 4 days, having returned to Red Creek a week ahead of Ethan to begin the account auditing work. She read the telegram twice. Then she set it on Agnes's kitchen table and pressed both hands flat against the wood surface and looked at the wall and thought about the Gardner family and the Wades and all 42 names in the ledger. And she thought about Samuel Callahan in a Santa Fe prison, dying of a treatable illness. And she thought about Pruitt's daughter Ruth going to teacher's school in Cheyenne in the fall. She thought about a rope tied around a hitching post in a town square on a Tuesday afternoon. She thought about a rifle shot fired into the sky. She thought about all the specific, ordinary, unspectacular decisions that had been made by a set of people who were not heroes and not villains, but something more complicated and more real. A postmistress who kept records for 2 years without knowing when they would matter. A frightened bookkeeper who turned his horse around in the dark. A sheriff who chose his daughter's name over his own comfort. A young man who rode the South Pass because the right person asked him to. Agnes came in from the garden and looked at the telegram and looked at Charlotte. "Well," she said. "Well," Charlotte agreed. Agnes put the kettle on. "He'll be back by Friday," Agnes said. "I know." "You have approximately 4 days to figure out what to say to him." "I know what I want to say to him," Charlotte said. Agnes turned from the stove. "Then say it on Friday." Charlotte smiled. "Yes, ma'am." Agnes made a sound of profound satisfaction and turned back to the kettle. Chaw. Ethan came back on a Friday afternoon, 8 miles from the south, the way he always came, without announcement, without ceremony, without any particular drama. He rode up to Agnes Fowler's house, Because Charlotte's things were still there, and Charlotte was sitting on the front step because she had been watching the South Road for an hour and was not going to pretend otherwise. He dismounted and tied his horse and looked at her. "Guilty," she said. "I heard," he said. "Telegraph reached me yesterday." She stood up. She had thought over the 4 days about what she wanted to say. Not rehearsed it exactly. She didn't rehearse things. It wasn't how she worked, but turned it over, the way she turned over a difficult column, looking for where the truth was simplest. "I've been thinking about Samuel," she said. He went still. "I've been thinking about what it means that what happened to him is now in the record. Overturned, documented, his name cleared." She met his eyes. "It doesn't bring him back. I know that. It doesn't undo 8 months in Santa Fe or the chest illness or what Caswell still has. But it means the record is true now. It means anyone who looks will find the truth instead of the lie." She paused. "That's not nothing, Ethan." He looked at her. "No," he said. His voice was very quiet. "It's not nothing." "And what we did here," she said. 42 families. The Gardners and the Wades and all the rest of them, they are going to have their books corrected. Their real numbers, their actual debt. Some of them are going to get land back. Some of them are going to have a different future than they thought they had a month ago." She stepped toward him. "That is not nothing either." "No," he said. "It isn't." She was close enough now to see his face clearly. The dark eyes. The careful steadiness. The thing underneath the steadiness that was only visible if you knew where to look, and she knew where to look. "I told you in the courthouse that my answer was yes," she said. "I want you to know that it still is. Not because you stood in a square and fired a rifle, although that mattered, but because of everything after. Because of the way you told me what was true, even when it was hard. Because you looked at my shaking hands and said my mother was wrong. Because you went to the Gardner ranch and sent the telegraph and stayed in Cheyenne for 3 weeks when you had a ranch to go home to." She held his gaze. "A person who does all of that is a person worth saying yes to." Ethan Callahan looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I am going to be honest with you about something." "Please," she said. "I came into Red Creek 8 months ago because of Samuel. Because of the injustice of it, and my own guilt at not having stopped it, and my intention to fix it, the way you fixed things that had gone wrong methodically with evidence from the outside." He paused. "That's still true. But somewhere in the last 4 weeks, it stopped being only that. And I want you to know that I am aware of the difference. And I am not asking you to be anything other than what you are. And I will follow your lead on what this becomes at whatever pace it becomes it." She looked at him. "That," she said, "is the most Ethan Callahan way of saying something that anyone has ever said anything." The real smile came back. Full, unguarded, the one that changed his face entirely, and lasted only a moment, and was worth every careful, patient, methodical day of the past 4 weeks. "Is that a yes?" he said. "It was a yes in the courthouse corridor," she said. "It's still a yes now. It will probably be a yes on Friday, and the Friday after that for quite some time." He reached out and took her hand. Not dramatically. Not with the grand gesture of a man claiming something. With the careful, deliberate, specific quality of someone placing something valuable where it belonged. She let her fingers close around his. Her hands were steady. They had been steady for weeks now. She had stopped noticing because that was how steadiness worked. It became the ground you stood on, not the thing you were managing, and you only knew how solid it was when you looked back at where you'd been standing before. She looked back. 4 days in an iron cell. A rope around a hitching post. 41 people in a summer square who had decided before anyone asked the right questions. A rifle shot into an afternoon sky from a man she didn't know who had made a decision she didn't understand yet and would spend weeks learning to understand fully. She looked forward. The South Road. 8 miles. A ranch that needed its books kept by someone who understood numbers the way other people understood stories. 42 families with fraudulent accounts that needed correcting. A federal auditor's appointment. Agnes Fowler's kitchen table, and Agnes Fowler's coffee, and Agnes Fowler's absolute refusal to pretend that what was true wasn't. Ruth Pruitt going to teacher's school in the fall. Daniel Gardner and his fast horse, and the South Pass in the dark. Martin Reeves making an honest record from here forward. All of it. Every specific, ordinary, unspectacular piece of it. Charlotte Bennett stood on Agnes Fowler's front step in Red Creek, Wyoming territory in the summer of 1882, with her hand in the hand of a man who had looked at her shaking hands and told her the truth about them, and she understood clearly, precisely, with the bookkeeper's certainty, that a correct number carried that a person's worth was not decided by a crowd in a square, or a powerful man's pointed finger, or a rope tied around a hitching post. It was decided by the people who chose, when every easier option was available, to stand still and tell the truth. And the truth once told could not be untold. It went into the record, it stayed there, and it was enough.